This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. At first, everything seemed idyllic. We'd spend weekends camping on the land, planning where we'd put the house and sketching out designs. The air was so fresh, the scenery breathtaking. I remember sitting by the creek one evening as the sun set, thinking I'd never felt so at peace. Things started to get weird when we broke ground on the construction. It was little things at first, tools going missing or turning up in odd places. The workers would grumble about misplacing things, but I didn't think much of it. Then one of the guys swore he saw someone watching him from the tree line. When he went to investigate, there was no one there. I tried to brush it off, but an uneasy feeling started to grow. At night, camping in our tent, I'd wake up to strange whispers that seemed to be coming from all around us. Jen said it was just the wind in the trees, but it sounded too deliberate, like voices having a conversation just below the threshold of understanding. About a month into construction, I was walking along the creek when something caught my eye. Half buried in the mud was some kind of small statue or figurine. When I pulled it out, my stomach turned. It was a crude carving of a humanoid figure, but grotesquely distorted. The proportions were all wrong, with elongated limbs and too many fingers. The face was the worst part. Instead of features, there was just a gaping maw filled with jagged teeth. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to take it back to our campsite. That night, I had vivid nightmares of being chased through dark woods by a towering version of the figurine. The next morning, the statue was gone. Jen swore she hadn't touched it. That's when the workers started quitting. They'd make excuses, family emergencies, better paying jobs elsewhere. But I could see the fear in their eyes. One guy flat out told me the place gave him the creeps and he couldn't work there anymore. We pressed on, trying to convince ourselves it was all in our heads, but things kept escalating. One night we heard what sounded like a child screaming in the field behind our tent. We ran out with flashlights, calling out, but found nothing. No tracks, no sign anyone had been there. But the screaming, it had sounded so real, so terrified. I still hear it in my dreams sometimes. The breaking point came about 2 months in. We'd been having trouble finding new workers, so Jen and I were doing a lot of the work ourselves. I was digging post holes for the fence when my shovel hit something solid. I cleared away the dirt, expecting a rock, but instead found myself staring at a human skull. I stumbled back, my heart racing. This had to be some kind of sick joke, right? But as I looked closer, I realized the skull wasn't quite right. The shape was off, the eye sockets too large, and there were strange markings carved into the bone, symbols I'd never seen before, but that filled me with a sense of dread. I called Jen over, my voice shaking. As she approached, the ground seemed to shift beneath us. A low rumble filled the air, and the skull began to sink back into the earth as if being pulled down. We both scrambled away, watching in horror as the ground swallowed it up, leaving no trace. That was it. We couldn't take it anymore. We packed up our stuff that very night and got the hell out of there. Put the land on the market the next day, willing to take a loss just to be rid of it. Went back to our tiny apartment in the city, but we couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. For weeks after, we'd wake up in the middle of the night to find all our furniture rearranged. Objects would disappear, only to turn up in impossible places. Once, I found that horrific figurine sitting on our kitchen table, even though I know I'd left it buried by the creek. We eventually moved to a different city, trying to put it all behind us. but I still have nightmares about that land. Sometimes I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a twisted, elongated shape watching me from the shadows. And on quiet nights, I swear I can still hear those whispers, calling me back to that cursed place. I don't know what was out there in those woods. Some ancient evil? A gateway to somewhere else? All I know is that some places are meant to be left alone. If you ever come across a piece of land that seems too perfect, too good to be true, trust your instincts and walk away. Some dreams aren't worth the price. I often wonder about the people who bought the land after us. Did they experience the same terrors? Or did whatever was out there go dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken again? Part of me wants to warn them, to reach out somehow. But a bigger part is too afraid of stirring up those memories, of inviting that presence back into our lives. Jen and I don't talk about it much anymore. We've tried to move on, to rebuild our lives and our dreams. But there's a shadow that hangs over us, a constant reminder of what we experienced. Sometimes I catch her staring off into the distance with a haunted look in her eyes, and I know she's thinking about it too. We've seen doctors, therapists, even a few psychics, anyone who might be able to help us make sense of what happened. But no one has any real answers. The doctors suggest it was stress-induced hallucinations. The therapists talk about shared delusions brought on by the pressure of such a big life change. The psychics, well, they just give us cryptic warnings and tell us to cleanse our auras. But none of them were there. None of them felt the oppressive weight of that presence, heard those unearthly whispers, or saw the impossible things we saw. How do you explain to someone that the land itself seemed alive and malevolent? That you could feel it watching you, toying with you, trying to break you down? I've done research, trying to find any history of the land that might explain what we experienced. But official records show nothing out of the ordinary. No massacres, no ancient burial grounds, no reports of paranormal activity. It's as if whatever is out there has erased its tracks, hiding from the world until it can lure in its next victims. Sometimes I wonder if we should have stayed, if we should have tried to uncover the truth of what was happening. But then I remember the sheer terror of those final days, the feeling that we were on the verge of something truly horrific. No, running was the only option. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I know this all sounds crazy. Believe me, there are days I try to convince myself it was all just an elaborate hallucination. But then I'll find a strange mark on my skin, shaped like one of those symbols from the skull. Or I'll wake up to find all the clocks in our house stopped at 3:33 a.m. Little reminders that what we experienced was all too real. So I'm sharing this as a warning. Be careful what you wish for. That perfect piece of land, that dream home in an idyllic setting, it might be hiding something sinister. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, if you get that prickle on the back of your neck like you're being watched, get out. Don't let curiosity or stubbornness keep you there. Some forces are beyond our understanding, and they don't take kindly to being disturbed. As for us, we're trying to rebuild our lives. We've given up on the idea of building our own home, at least for now. The thought of breaking ground anywhere fills us with dread. Instead, we're focusing on making our small apartment a home, surrounding ourselves with friends and family, trying to drown out the memories with the noise of a busy city life. But late at night, when the world goes quiet, I still find myself listening for those whispers, for that child's scream, for any sign that it's found us again. And I wonder, not for the first time, if we ever truly escaped that cursed land, or if a part of us will always be trapped there, lost in those dark woods, running from something we can never fully understand. We had rented this quaint little beach house for a week in July. My wife and I were so excited to get away from work and spend some quality time with our two kids, ages 8 and 10. When we first arrived, everything seemed perfect. The house was cozy and charming, with weathered wood siding and a wraparound porch overlooking the ocean. The kids were thrilled to have bunk beds in their room. That first evening, we all sat out on the porch watching the sunset, feeling grateful for this chance to unwind and reconnect as a family. The first few days were blissful. We spent hours playing in the waves, building sandcastles, hunting for seashells. In the evenings, we'd grill out on the porch and play board games. I remember thinking how lucky we were to have found this quiet stretch of beach, away from the crowded tourist areas. It was on the fourth day that things started to feel off. We were eating lunch on the porch when my daughter pointed down the beach and asked, "Who's that man standing there?" I looked where she was pointing but didn't see anyone. "What man, honey?" I asked. She insisted there was a tall man in dark clothes just standing and staring at our house. I scanned the beach again, but saw no one. I tried to reassure her that it was probably just a shadow or her imagination, but she seemed unsettled. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. needing to use the bathroom. As I was heading back to bed, I glanced out the window and froze. There, illuminated by the moonlight, was a figure standing motionless in our yard, facing the house. My heart started pounding. I blinked hard. Sure, I must be seeing things. But when I looked again, the figure was still there. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark silhouette. Suddenly it turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I told myself it must have been a drunk wandering by, or maybe someone sleepwalking, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I casually asked my wife if she had heard any noises in the night. She hadn't. I decided not to mention what I'd seen, not wanting to scare the kids. But I found myself constantly glancing out the windows, scanning the beach. That day at the beach felt tense. I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. I insisted the kids stay close, making up excuses about riptides. As we were packing up to head in, I noticed strange marks in the sand near our chairs, almost like something had been dragged through. A chill ran down my spine. That evening, the power flickered on and off a few times. Must be a faulty connection, I reasoned. But each time the lights went out, I imagined that figure standing in the darkness, watching us. I suggested we play a board game to keep everyone in the living room together. Every sound, creaking floorboards, branches scraping the roof, made me jump. I barely slept that night, lying awake listening for any unusual noises. Around 3 a.m., I heard slow, heavy footsteps on the porch. My whole body tensed. The steps moved along the porch, stopping outside each window. When they reached our bedroom window, I held my breath. Long seconds passed. Then the steps moved on. I wanted to get up and look, but I was paralyzed with fear. The next morning, there were muddy footprints on the porch. My wife was disturbed, wondering if we should call the police. But what would we tell them? That we were scared of an unidentified figure who hadn't actually done anything. I cleaned up the footprints and tried to act like everything was fine. But everything was far from fine. That day was our last full day at the beach house. The kids seemed to pick up on the tension and were unusually quiet. We stayed inside most of the day, all of us jumping at small noises. As the sun started to set, my son asked in a small voice if we could leave early. Part of me wanted to say yes, to pack up and get the hell out of there, but I was determined not to let fear ruin our vacation. I put on a brave face and suggested we watch a movie together. As we settled in to watch, the power went out completely. The house was plunged into darkness. My wife fumbled for her phone to use as a flashlight. In that moment of pitch black, I heard a scraping sound from upstairs. "Everyone stay here," I whispered, grabbing a heavy flashlight from the kitchen. Heart pounding, I crept up the stairs. The scraping sound was coming from the kids' room. Hands shaking, I pushed open the door and shone the flashlight inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a figure crouched by the window, trying to pry it open from the inside. It slowly turned to face me. In the beam of the flashlight, I saw a gaunt face with sunken eyes and grayish skin. It didn't look fully human. For a split second, we stared at each other in shock. Then it let out a horrible shriek and lunged at me. I swung the flashlight wildly, connecting with its head. It crumpled to the floor. I yelled for my family to get in the car, not taking my eyes off the creature. They must have heard the panic in my voice, because in seconds I heard them scrambling out the door. The thing on the floor started to stir. I bolted down the stairs and out to the car, peeling out of the driveway. We drove through the night in silence, the kids huddled and crying in the back seat. I kept checking the rearview mirror, terrified we were being followed. We didn't stop until we reached home the next morning. To this day, I don't know what that thing was or why it was stalking us. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a sick homeless person or someone on drugs. But deep down I know it was something else, something not of this world. We never went back to that beach. I still have nightmares about that gaunt face in the darkness. Sometimes I wake up sure I can hear those heavy footsteps outside my window. That week was supposed to give us happy family memories. Instead, it left us with trauma we're still trying to process. I find myself being overprotective of my kids, paranoid about their safety. My wife and I fight more, the stress of what happened creating a wedge between us. Part of me wishes I could forget it all, go back to when the beach meant fun and relaxation. But I know I'll never be able to shake the terror of that night, the realization that evil things lurk in the shadows, waiting to shatter our sense of safety when we least expect it. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway with my friends Alice, Aaron, and Georgia. We had been planning this trip for weeks, a chance to escape the city and unwind in nature. The drive up to the mountains was beautiful, with winding roads through forests painted in autumn colors. We were all in high spirits, laughing and singing along to road trip playlists. When we arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon, it seemed perfect, rustic and cozy, nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. We unloaded the car, chose our rooms, and spent the rest of the daylight hours exploring the property. There was a small lake nearby where we skipped rocks and watched the sunset reflect off the still water. As dusk fell, we gathered firewood and got a crackling fire going in the fire pit outside. Roasting marshmallows and sharing stories around the flames, everything felt so peaceful. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles. Stars began to appear in the darkening sky above the treetops. It was exactly the escape from civilization we had been craving. If only I had known then how quickly that peace would shatter. As the fire died down to embers, we decided to head inside and get some sleep. The cabin only had 2 bedrooms, so Alice and Georgia took one, while Aaron and I set up sleeping bags in the main living area. We said our good nights and settled in. the quiet of the forest lulling us towards sleep. I'm not sure how long I had been dozing when the first noise jolted me awake. It was a sharp crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. My eyes flew open, heart suddenly racing. I held my breath, straining to listen. For a few long moments there was only silence. I had almost convinced myself I'd imagined it when I heard it again. Another crack, closer this time. Then another. Something was moving through the woods towards the cabin. "Aaron," I whispered urgently. "Aaron, wake up. Do you hear that?" He stirred groggily. "Huh? What's wrong?" "Listen," I hissed. "There's something out there." We both went still, ears pricked. The snapping sounds had stopped, but now there was a new noise, a low, rhythmic thumping. Footsteps circling the cabin. Aaron sat up, suddenly alert. "What the hell is that?" My mouth had gone dry. "I don't know. An animal, maybe?" But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't right. The footsteps were too deliberate, too measured to be an animal. Whatever was out there was walking on two legs. We scrambled out of our sleeping bags, fumbling for flashlights. Aaron went to peek out the window while I moved to wake the girls. Just as I reached their door, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. It came from right outside, inhuman and guttural. Alice and Georgia burst out of their room, eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" Georgia cried. "Oh my God, what's happening?" Before anyone could answer, there was a thunderous bang on the front door. We all jumped, clustering together in the middle of the room. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. Bang, bang, bang. The door shuddered in its frame with each impact. Whatever was out there was trying to get in. "We need to call for help," Alice said, voice shaking as she reached for her phone. But there was no signal. We were miles from the nearest town, completely cut off. The banging stopped as suddenly as it had started. An eerie silence fell. We stood frozen, hardly daring to move. Then came a sound that chilled me to my core, the slow turning of the doorknob. I realized with horror that in our haste to get inside earlier, we had forgotten to lock it. Aaron lunged for the door, slamming his body against it just as it started to open. He fumbled with the lock, finally clicking it into place. "Help me barricade it!" he shouted. We snapped into action, shoving furniture in front of the door. Couches, chairs, anything we could move. All the while, that presence lurked just outside. We could hear its ragged breathing, feel its malevolent energy seeping through the walls. For hours, we huddled together in the center of the cabin. Every creak of the old wooden structure made us flinch. Shadows danced at the edges of our flashlight beams. The girls were crying softly. I kept expecting the windows to shatter at any moment, but nothing else happened. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the trees, the oppressive feeling of being watched finally lifted. We waited until full daylight before cautiously venturing outside. There were no footprints, no signs of disturbance. Nothing to prove that the horrors of the night had been real. And yet, we all knew what we had experienced. Without discussion, we packed up our things and left immediately, the idyllic cabin retreat turning into a frantic escape. In the weeks since, I've tried to rationalize what happened, to find some logical explanation. But I can't shake the bone-deep certainty that something truly evil was out there in those woods, something that wanted to harm us. I still have nightmares about that night, about what might have happened if that door had opened. We were lucky to make it out unscathed. But a part of me wonders, did we really escape? Or did we just delay the inevitable? Sometimes I catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a dark figure lurking at the edge of the trees, waiting, watching. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again, after what we experienced in that cabin. Some terrors leave scars that never fully heal. I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. That all changed after my stay at the Grand Willow Hotel last month. I still get chills thinking about what happened in room 217. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway. I had been working long hours at my job and desperately needed a break. When I came across a great deal for the historic Grand Willow Hotel online, I jumped at the chance to book a room. The photos showed a beautiful Victorian-era building with ornate architecture and luxurious furnishings. It seemed perfect. I arrived at the hotel late Friday afternoon. The exterior was just as impressive as the photos. A massive brick building with tall windows and intricate details everywhere you looked. The lobby was equally grand, with soaring ceilings, gleaming wood floors, and antique furniture. The woman at the front desk was friendly as she checked me in and handed over the old-fashioned brass key to room 217. "Enjoy your stay," she said with a smile. If only she knew what was in store for me. I made my way up to the second floor, dragging my suitcase behind me. The hallway was dimly lit, with faded floral wallpaper and creaky floorboards. I found room 217 at the end of the hall and let myself in. The room itself was lovely, spacious with high ceilings, antique furniture, and a large four-poster bed. Big windows looked out over the immaculately manicured grounds. I unpacked my things and settled in, feeling relaxed already. As evening fell, I decided to grab dinner at the hotel restaurant downstairs. The food was excellent, and I enjoyed a glass of wine while chatting with some other guests. Everyone raved about the historic charm of the Grand Willow. One older couple mentioned they came every year for their anniversary. "You're in for a treat," the woman told me with a wink. "This place is full of history. Some say it's even haunted." I laughed it off, not taking her seriously. If only I had known then how right she was. I returned to my room around 10 p.m., feeling pleasantly tired after the long day of travel. I got ready for bed and settled in with a book, enjoying the peace and quiet. That's when things started to get strange. It began with soft noises coming from the hallway outside my door. At first I thought it was just other guests, but the sounds didn't quite fit. Instead of footsteps or voices, it was more like rustling, a swishing noise, as if long skirts were brushing against the walls. But it was late. Surely no one would be wearing formal attire at this hour. I tried to ignore it and focus on my book, but the noises continued, sometimes fading away, only to start up again a few minutes later. It was unsettling. Then came the knocks. 3 sharp raps on my door that made me jump. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. I got up to check, but when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. Feeling uneasy, I double-checked that the door was locked before getting back into bed. I told myself I was just being silly. Old buildings make strange noises all the time, right? But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The room felt different somehow, colder, and I had the distinct sensation of being watched. I turned off the lights, hoping sleep would help calm my nerves. But as I lay there in the darkness, the sounds continued. Creaks and groans from the floorboards. More knocking, sometimes on the door and sometimes on the walls. At one point, I could have sworn I heard a woman's voice whispering, but the words were too faint to make out. I barely slept at all that night. When morning finally came, I was exhausted and on edge. I seriously considered checking out early, but told myself I was overreacting. It was probably just my imagination combined with an unfamiliar place. I spent most of the day out exploring the town, glad to be away from the room. But as evening approached, I felt a sense of dread about returning to the hotel. Back in room 217, things were quiet at first. I started to relax, thinking maybe the previous night had just been a fluke. I was wrong. Around 9 p.m., the temperature in the room suddenly plummeted. I could see my breath in the air. The lights began to flicker, and that's when I saw her. A woman, translucent and glowing faintly, appeared at the foot of my bed. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, wearing a long white nightgown. Her face was beautiful, but filled with sadness. I was frozen in terror, unable to move or speak. The ghost woman reached out towards me, her mouth opening as if to say something, but no sound came out. Just as suddenly as she appeared, she vanished. The room returned to normal temperature and the lights stabilized. I was shaking uncontrollably. This couldn't be real, could it? Ghosts weren't real. And yet I knew with absolute certainty that I had just seen one with my own eyes. I ran out of the room, not even bothering to grab my things. I burst into the lobby, frantic and babbling about what I'd seen. The night manager listened calmly, then sighed. "I was afraid this might happen," he said. "Room 217 has a history." He went on to tell me the tragic story. In 1912, a young woman named Emily had been staying in that room. She was waiting for her lover, who had promised to meet her there so they could elope, but he never showed up. Heartbroken, Emily fell asleep with a lit candle by her bed. The candle tipped over, starting a fire. Emily didn't wake up in time to escape. Ever since then, there have been reports of strange occurrences in that room, the manager explained. Some guests see her, others just experience unexplained phenomena. We've had the room blessed, brought in paranormal experts. Nothing seems to help. Emily's spirit is still waiting for her love to come. I was stunned. Part of me still wanted to rationalize it all away, but I knew what I had seen. Emily's ghost was real, and she was trapped in that room, reliving her tragedy over and over. The manager offered to move me to a different room, but I couldn't bear to stay in the hotel another night. I grabbed my luggage from 217 as quickly as possible and checked out, driving through the night to get home. It's been a month now, and I still can't stop thinking about what happened at the Grand Willow Hotel. I've done research, trying to find out more about Emily and her story. I've even considered going back, though the thought terrifies me. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully explain or understand what I experienced in room 217. But I know this. I'll never doubt the existence of ghosts again. And my heart breaks for Emily, forever waiting for a love that will never come. On our third day in Cusco, we signed up for a guided tour of some remote ruins about an hour outside the city. Our guide, Carlos, picked us up early in the morning. He seemed friendly and knowledgeable, pointing out interesting sights as we drove into the mountains. When we arrived at the ruins, I was in awe. Crumbling stone structures covered in vines stretched out before us, with mist rolling through the ancient city. Carlos led us through the site, explaining the history and pointing out intricate carvings. As we explored deeper into the ruins, he started telling us about local legends. "They say people have disappeared in these ruins," Carlos said in a low voice. "The ancient spirits still protect this place. Sometimes they take offerings." I laughed nervously, assuming he was just trying to spook us tourists. But as we continued on, I started to feel uneasy. The air felt thicker, heavier somehow. The mist seemed to close in around us. I noticed my friends exchanging worried glances. We came to a small stone building that Carlos said was a temple. As we stepped inside, I felt a chill run down my spine. The temperature dropped noticeably. Carlos was in the middle of explaining some carvings when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, looking around frantically. We all fell silent, straining to listen. I didn't hear anything except the pounding of my own heart. Carlos's face had gone pale. "We need to leave, now." He turned and rushed toward the entrance. Just as he reached the doorway, there was a strange whooshing sound. Carlos let out a strangled cry, and then he was gone, simply vanished into thin air. For a moment, we all stood frozen in shock. Then panic set in. We ran out of the temple, calling Carlos's name, but there was no sign of him anywhere. "This can't be happening," my friend Anna sobbed. "People don't just disappear." But he had. Our guide had vanished without a trace, leaving us lost and terrified in the middle of these ancient ruins. We searched for hours, combing every inch of the site, but it was like Carlos had never existed. As the sun began to set, we realized we needed to find our way back to the van and get help. Getting out of the ruins was a nightmare. We kept getting turned around, the paths seeming to shift and change. The mist grew thicker until we could barely see a few feet in front of us. Strange whispers seemed to echo from the stones. More than once, I could have sworn I saw shadowy figures darting between the buildings. Night had fallen by the time we finally stumbled out of the ruins. We piled into the van and sped back toward Cusco, all of us shaken to the core. We went straight to the police station to report what had happened. The authorities searched the ruins for days, but found no trace of Carlos. They seemed skeptical of our story, implying that maybe our guide had simply abandoned us. But we knew what we saw. A man had vanished into thin air right in front of us. That was 3 years ago, and I still have nightmares about those ruins. I've never been able to explain what happened that day. Sometimes I wonder if we accidentally wandered into some kind of portal or alternate dimension. Other times, I think about Carlos's stories of spirits taking offerings, and I shudder. All I know for sure is that our fun vacation turned into a living nightmare in the blink of an eye. One minute everything was normal, the next we were thrown into some kind of paranormal horror movie. The worst part is not knowing what happened to Carlos, not knowing if we were in real danger ourselves, not knowing if those ruins are truly haunted by ancient forces beyond our understanding. I've tried to move on with my life, but I don't think I'll ever fully recover from that experience. It fundamentally shook my understanding of reality. If a person can just disappear without a trace, what else might be possible? What other horrors might be lurking just out of sight in this world? I still keep in touch with the friends who were on that trip. We don't talk about it much, but I know it haunts them too. Anna had to go to therapy to deal with the trauma. Mike refuses to travel anywhere remote now. And me? I find myself obsessively researching unexplained disappearances, looking for any possible explanation for what we experienced. Sometimes I think about going back to Peru, back to those ruins, to search for answers, to see if I can make sense of what happened. But then I remember the soul-deep terror I felt that day, the oppressive atmosphere, the whispers in the mist, the look of absolute fear on Carlos's face in that final moment. And I know I can never go back there. I'm sharing this story now in the hopes that someone out there might have answers. Has anyone else experienced something like this? Am I crazy for still fixating on it after all this time? I just want to understand what happened that day. I want to know what became of Carlos. Most of all, I want to know if we were in real danger in those ruins. Because sometimes, in my darkest moments, I can't shake the feeling that something was hunting us that day. That Carlos wasn't taken randomly, but sacrificed to save the rest of us, and that whatever ancient power dwells in those mountains is still out there, waiting. If you're planning a trip to Peru, please be careful. Stick to the well-traveled tourist sites. Don't venture off into remote ruins, no matter how tempting the adventure seems, because I've seen firsthand that there are things in this world that can't be explained, forces beyond our comprehension. And sometimes people really do just disappear without a trace. It was a moonless night in late October, must have been around 2 a.m. I was hauling a load of car parts from Atlanta down to New Orleans, fighting to keep my eyes open as the miles ticked by. The road stretched out endlessly before me, nothing but darkness beyond the reach of my headlights. I was looking forward to hitting the next rest stop to grab some coffee and stretch my legs. As I pulled into the dimly lit rest area, I noticed it was deserted except for one other semi-parked way in the back. Not unusual for that time of night. I climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on the gravel. The air was damp and chilly, and an unsettling stillness hung over the place. I had just stepped out of the restroom, styrofoam coffee cup in hand, when movement caught my eye. A figure was standing motionless at the edge of the parking lot, half hidden in shadow. At first I thought it was another driver, but as I looked closer, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The man, if you could call him that, was dressed in old-fashioned clothes that looked like they were from another century. A tattered coat hung from his thin frame, and a wide-brimmed hat obscured most of his face. But what I could see of it was deathly pale, almost glowing in the dim light. As I stared, frozen in place, he slowly raised his head, and I found myself locking eyes with him. His eyes, God, his eyes. They seemed to glow with an eerie inner light, boring into me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Then I noticed his hand. It was dripping with what looked horribly like fresh blood. A jolt of pure terror shot through me. I dropped my coffee and bolted for my truck, fumbling with shaking hands to get the door open. As I clambered inside, I risked a glance back. The man was gone. I sat there for a long moment, heart pounding, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. Maybe it was just some homeless guy in weird clothes. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real, and it wasn't human. I got back on the road as fast as I could, putting miles between me and that rest stop. But I couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes watching me. Every shadow on the roadside seemed to hide some lurking presence. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see that pale face staring back at me. About an hour later, I was nearing the Alabama state line when I saw a figure standing on the shoulder ahead. As I got closer, my blood ran cold. It was him, the same man in the same old-fashioned clothes, standing perfectly still, those glowing eyes fixed on me as I approached. I swerved instinctively, nearly running off the road. When I looked in my mirror, the shoulder was empty. By this point, I was in full-blown panic mode. I was wide awake now, adrenaline coursing through me. I considered pulling over to call the police, but the thought of stopping filled me with dread. So I kept driving, white-knuckling the steering wheel, jumping at every shadow. The next few hours passed in a blur of paranoia and fear. I saw him twice more, once standing in a field as I passed, and again at a crossroads, always with those burning eyes locked onto me. Each time he vanished as soon as I looked away. I felt like I was losing my mind. As dawn began to break, casting the landscape in a gray half-light, I thought maybe the nightmare was over. I was nearing my destination, only about an hour out of New Orleans. I started to relax, thinking I had somehow escaped whatever hellish thing had been stalking me through the night. That's when I saw him again. This time he was much closer, standing right next to the highway, barely 20 feet from my truck. As I rocketed past at 70 mep, I saw his face clearly for the first time. It was gaunt and corpse-like, with sunken cheeks and skin like wax. But those eyes, they burned into me with an inhuman intensity. And then I heard his voice in my head, clear as day, as if he was sitting right next to me. "Help me," it said. Just those two words, filled with a desperate, aching loneliness that chilled me to my core. I lost it. I stomped on the gas, pushing my rig to its limits. I don't know how fast I was going, but it wasn't nearly fast enough, because somehow, impossibly, he was keeping pace. Every time I looked in my mirror, he was there. Running alongside the truck at highway speeds, those glowing eyes never leaving mine. I don't remember much after that. Somehow I made it to my delivery point, but I have no memory of the last stretch of the drive. I was a shaking, sweating mess when I finally stopped. The guys at the loading dock must have thought I was on drugs or having some kind of breakdown. It's been months now, and I still can't make sense of what happened that night. Was it all in my head? Some kind of hallucination brought on by fatigue? Or did I really encounter something not of this world? I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it wasn't real. But every time I close my eyes, I see that pale face, those burning eyes, and I hear that voice in my head, pleading for help. I don't drive nights anymore. I can't bring myself to get behind the wheel after dark. The open road that I once loved now fills me with a nameless dread, because I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, waiting, watching. And one of these nights, he might find me again. I don't know why I'm sharing this. Maybe writing it down will help me process it somehow. Or maybe I just need someone else to know what happened to me out there in the darkness. All I know is I'll never forget that night, and I'll never feel truly safe on the road again. Around 2 a.m., I was getting drowsy, thinking about pulling over at the next rest stop. That's when I first saw her, a woman in a white dress standing on the shoulder. My headlights caught her for just a second as I sped by. I figured I was seeing things from fatigue. But a few miles later, there she was again. Same white dress, same spot on the roadside. I slowed down, thinking maybe she needed help. As I got closer, I noticed something off about her eyes. They were glowing like a cat's eyes in headlights, but brighter, almost electric blue. I got a chill down my spine. This wasn't right. I sped up, heart pounding. In my side mirror, I swear I saw her turn her head to follow my truck as I passed. I white-knuckled the steering wheel, telling myself I was just tired, seeing things. That's when my engine started sputtering. "No, no, no," I muttered, watching the temperature gauge spike into the red. I managed to pull over onto the shoulder just as the engine died completely. I sat there for a minute, trying to calm down. The fog pressed in around the truck, so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet past the hood. I tried the radio, but got nothing but static. My cell had no service. I was going to have to get out and check the engine. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the cab. The fog was like soup, dense and cold. I popped the hood and started checking belts and hoses, looking for the problem. That's when I heard it. Footsteps on the gravel, coming from behind the truck. I spun around, heart in my throat. The beam of my flashlight cut through the fog, illuminating her. She was maybe 30 feet away, just standing there in that white dress. Her skin was pale, almost blue in the flashlight beam. And those eyes, God, those eyes, glowing like LED lights, fixed right on me. I stumbled backward, slamming into the front of my truck. Who are you?" I managed to croak out. She didn't answer, just took a step closer. I could see her face clearer now. She was young, maybe mid-20s, and would have been pretty if not for how utterly wrong she looked. Her skin had a waxy, almost translucent quality, and there was something about the way she moved, too smooth, like she was gliding rather than walking. "What do you want?" I yelled, trying to sound braver than I felt. She cocked her head to the side, like a curious animal. Then she smiled. It wasn't a normal smile, her mouth opened too wide, showing too many teeth. I felt my bladder let go, a warm trickle down my leg. She was maybe 15 feet away now. I could hear a sound coming from her, a high-pitched keening, like the wind through a cracked window. My whole body was shaking. I wanted to run, but I was frozen in place. That's when my flashlight flickered and died. I was plunged into darkness, with only the faint glow of her eyes visible. I heard her footsteps getting closer, that keening sound growing louder. I lost it. I turned and ran, stumbling through the fog. I could hear her behind me, moving faster than should be possible. I ran into the middle of the road, waving my arms, praying for a car to come by. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I saw headlights approaching. I waved frantically, screaming for help. The car slowed, an old station wagon driven by an elderly couple. They rolled down the window, looking concerned. "Are you all right, son?" the old man asked. I turned to point at the woman in white, to show them what was chasing me, but she was gone. The fog was starting to lift, and I could see for a good distance in both directions. There was no sign of her. The couple gave me a ride to the nearest town. I called for a tow truck and spent the rest of the night in a dingy motel, jumping at every sound. When I went back for my rig the next morning, it started up fine. No sign of any mechanical issues. I've driven that stretch of road many times since then. Never saw her again. But I've talked to other truckers. Turns out there's a story about that area. They say it's haunted by the ghost of a bride who died in a car crash on her wedding night decades ago. She appears to travelers, trying to hitch a ride to her wedding that never happened. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I know what I saw that night. Those eyes. I still see them in my nightmares. Sometimes when I'm driving late at night, I catch myself scanning the roadside, half expecting to see her standing there in that white dress. I don't know what would have happened if that couple hadn't driven by when they did, and part of me never wants to find out. It was around 2 a.m., and I was hauling a load of electronics down a desolate stretch of highway in rural Nebraska. The darkness seemed to press in on all sides, with only my headlights cutting through the inky blackness. I'd been on the road for hours and was starting to feel the fatigue setting in. That's when I saw it, an old gas station sign looming out of the darkness ahead. At first, I was relieved. I figured I could pull over, stretch my legs, maybe grab a coffee if the place was open. But as I got closer, I realized something was off. The sign was rusted and faded, barely legible, and there were no lights on anywhere. I should have just kept driving. But curiosity got the better of me. I hadn't seen any other buildings for miles, and I wondered how long this place had been abandoned. So I pulled off the highway and into the crumbling parking lot. As soon as I cut the engine, an eerie silence descended. No crickets, no distant traffic, just total, oppressive quiet. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the cab, my boots crunching on the gravel. The beam of my flashlight swept over the dilapidated building. Broken windows, peeling paint, weeds growing up through cracks in the concrete. It looked like it had been deserted for decades, but something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I approached cautiously, telling myself I was just going to take a quick look around and then get back on the road. As I got closer to the building, I noticed strange marks in the dust coating the windows, almost like handprints, but distorted somehow. That's when I heard it. A soft shuffling sound, like footsteps, coming from inside the station. I froze, my heart pounding. It had to be an animal that had gotten in, I told myself. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and scared in the darkness. "Is anyone there?" No response, just more shuffling, getting closer to the door. I should have run right then, but some morbid fascination kept me rooted to the spot. The door creaked open slowly, scraping against the ground. And that's when things got really weird. At first, I didn't see anything in the doorway, but then I noticed a shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising off hot pavement. It started to take shape, the outline of a person, but transparent and flickering like a bad TV signal. I stumbled backwards, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real, but as I watched in horror, the shape solidified into the figure of a man. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, like something from the 1950s. And his face, God, his face. It was gaunt and pale, with dark hollows where his eyes should have been. A whispering voice drifted on the air. "Help me, please, help me." I wanted to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. The ghostly figure drifted closer, one skeletal hand reaching out towards me. I could feel the temperature dropping, my breath coming out in visible puffs. What do you want?" I managed to stammer out. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Help me, trapped, so long." Suddenly, more whispers joined in, echoing from all around me. I spun around wildly, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. More ghostly figures were materializing. Men, women, even children, all with the same hollow-eyed stares, all reaching out with spectral hands. I finally found my legs and ran for the truck. The whispering grew to a fever pitch behind me, a cacophony of pleas for help. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking violently. As I wrenched open the door, I felt an icy touch on the back of my neck. I whirled around to see the first ghost right behind me, its face inches from mine. Those empty eye sockets bored into me, and I felt like I was falling into an abyss of despair and loneliness. I don't know how I managed to tear myself away and get into the truck. I gunned the engine and peeled out of there, gravel flying. In my rearview mirror, I could see the ghostly figures gathered at the edge of the lot, watching me go. I drove for hours without stopping, my hands clenched on the steering wheel. When the sun finally came up, I pulled over at a rest stop and broke down sobbing. It's been a week, and I still can't shake the memory of what I saw. The pleading voices haunt my dreams. Sometimes I catch glimpses of pale, transparent figures out of the corner of my eye. I don't know what happened at that gas station or why those spirits are trapped there. Part of me feels guilty for not trying to help them somehow, but a bigger part is just terrified of ever encountering anything like that again. I've thought about going to the police or trying to research the history of that place. But who would believe me? I can barely believe it myself. All I know is that I'll never drive that stretch of highway again, and I'll always wonder about those lost souls crying out for help in the darkness. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, I'm not even sure I believe it myself some days. But I know what I saw and experienced that night. It shook me to my core and changed how I see the world. There are things out there beyond our understanding, lurking in forgotten places, and sometimes they reach out to the living, desperate for help or connection. I still drive trucks, but I'm not the same person I was before that night. Every abandoned building I pass fills me with dread. Every unexplained sound in the darkness sets my heart racing. I find myself avoiding night runs when I can, and I always make sure to stick to well-lit, populated areas. Sometimes I wonder if I should have tried to do something to help those spirits. But what could I have done? I'm just a simple truck driver, not some kind of paranormal expert. And the terror I felt in that moment was overwhelming. Fight or flight kicked in, and flight won out. I've tried to research that stretch of highway since then, looking for any history of a gas station or reports of strange occurrences. But I've found nothing concrete. It's like the place doesn't exist, except in my memory. There are nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, the whispers of "help me" echoing in my mind. I see those hollow-eyed faces in the shadows of my room. The icy touch on the back of my neck feels as real as it did that night. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from what I experienced. It's changed my whole worldview. I used to be skeptical of ghost stories and paranormal claims. Now I'm not so sure. There's more to this world than we can explain or understand. To anyone reading this who might be tempted to explore abandoned places at night, be careful. You never know what might be waiting in the darkness. Some things are better left undisturbed. I don't know why I was the one to stumble upon that haunted gas station. Was it random chance, or was I somehow drawn there? Either way, it's an experience that will stay with me for the rest of my life. I've thought about going back during the day to see if I can find any trace of what I saw, but the fear is too great. What if they're still there waiting? What if they try to keep me there with them? So I drive on, haunted by memories and unanswered questions. And every time I pass a decrepit old building on a lonely stretch of road, I say a silent prayer for any lost souls that might be trapped there, unable to move on. I don't know if sharing this story will help me process what happened or just make people think I'm crazy. But I needed to get it out somehow. If nothing else, maybe it will serve as a warning to others. Be careful out there on the dark roads at night. You never know what you might encounter. Been a long-haul trucker for over 15 years now. I've seen my fair share of weird stuff on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for that night. It was supposed to be a routine drive, pick up a load in Oklahoma, deliver it to Nebraska. Simple enough, right? I left around 10 p.m., figuring I'd drive through the night and make good time. The first few hours were uneventful. Just me, my thermos of coffee, and the endless highway stretching out ahead. As I crossed into Kansas, a thick fog started rolling in. At first it was just wisps here and there, but soon it was so dense I could barely see 20 feet in front of my truck. I slowed way down, straining to make out the road. The fog seemed to swallow up my headlights. It was eerily quiet, too. No other cars on the road, just the rumble of my engine. I started to get an uneasy feeling, like something wasn't right, but I shook it off and kept driving. That's when I saw him. A figure suddenly illuminated in my headlights, standing right on the shoulder of the road. I nearly had a heart attack, swerving to avoid him. As I regained control, I glanced in my mirror and saw him still standing there, hand raised like he was hitchhiking. Every instinct told me to keep driving. Pick up a stranger in the middle of nowhere at 2 a.m.? Hell no. But something made me pull over. Maybe it was the fog playing tricks on my mind, or maybe I was just lonely after hours of solitude. Either way, I found myself stopping and rolling down the passenger window. "Need a ride?" I called out. The figure approached slowly. As he got closer, I could make out more details. It was a man, looked to be in his 40s or 50s. He was wearing an old tattered coat and had this distant look in his eyes. "Much obliged," he said in a raspy voice as he climbed into the cab. Up close, there was something off about him. His skin was pale, almost gray, and he had this faint smell like damp earth. We rode in silence for a few minutes. I tried to focus on the road, but I could feel his eyes on me. It was unnerving. Finally, he spoke. "You ever see anything strange out here on these roads?" I shrugged, trying to play it cool. "Nah, not really. Just your typical night drive." He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, I think you have. We all have. The spirits that roam these highways, they're always watching, waiting." A chill ran down my spine. What the hell was this guy talking about? "You believe in ghosts, friend?" he asked, leaning in closer. I could feel his breath on my neck. It was ice cold. No, not really," I stammered. My hands were shaking on the wheel. He smiled, revealing teeth that looked unnaturally sharp. "Oh, but you should. They're all around us, you know, especially on nights like this." I was really starting to freak out now. Who was this guy? What did he want? I was about to tell him I was letting him off at the next exit when he suddenly shouted, "Stop the truck!" I slammed on the brakes instinctively. We screeched to a halt in the middle of the road. Before I could say anything, he was out the door and disappearing into the fog. My heart was pounding. What the fuck just happened? I sat there for a minute trying to calm down. Part of me wanted to floor it and get the hell out of there, but I was worried about hitting the guy if he was still on the road. I decided to get out and look around. Big mistake. As soon as I stepped out of the truck, the fog seemed to close in around me. I could barely see my hand in front of my face, and it was dead silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded muffled, like the fog was swallowing it up. No response. I took a few steps forward, peering into the gloom. That's when I heard it, a whisper right behind me. I whirled around, but there was nothing there. Then another whisper from a different direction, and another. Soon it was like I was surrounded by disembodied voices, all speaking too low for me to make out the words. I started to panic. I tried to run back to my truck, but I couldn't see it anymore. The fog was so thick I'd lost all sense of direction. The whispers were getting louder, closing in. Suddenly I felt a hand grab my shoulder. I yelled and spun around, coming face to face with him, the hitchhiker. But he looked different now. His eyes were pitch black, and his skin seemed to be shifting like smoke. "I told you," he hissed. "The spirits are always watching, and now they want you to join them." I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like I was paralyzed. The hitchhiker started to laugh, a horrible, inhuman sound that echoed all around me. The fog began to swirl, taking on shapes. I saw faces forming in the mist, twisted, agonized faces. They were reaching for me, their fingers like tendrils of smoke. I squeezed my eyes shut and screamed. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a nightmare. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in my truck. The fog was gone, and the sun was starting to rise. I was parked on the shoulder of the road, engine off. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had happened. Had it all been a dream? Some kind of hallucination brought on by fatigue? But it had felt so real. I checked my phone. It was 7 a.m. Somehow 5 hours had passed that I couldn't account for, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on my shoulder, was a handprint. A gray, ashy handprint that hadn't been there before. I quit my job that day. I couldn't bring myself to get back on the road. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me, waiting. I see shadows out of the corner of my eye, hear whispers in empty rooms. I don't know what happened to me that night. Maybe I'm going crazy. Or maybe there really are spirits out there on those lonely highways. And sometimes they decide to take passengers of their own. I know one thing for sure. I'll never pick up another hitchhiker as long as I live. And if you're ever driving on a foggy night and see someone on the side of the road, just keep driving. For your own sake, just keep driving. I was lounging on the couch watching TV, enjoying having the house to myself. It was around 9 p.m. when I first heard it, a faint thudding sound coming from the basement. At first I tried to ignore it, figuring it was just the old house settling or maybe the neighbors, but the sounds kept getting louder and more insistent. My heart started racing as I muted the TV and listened intently. There was definitely something going on down there. Thud, thud, thud. It sounded like footsteps. I was frozen in fear for a few moments, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but I knew I had to check it out. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. As I crept towards the basement door, I was already imagining the worst. A burglar, a murderer, some crazed lunatic. The door creaked loudly as I slowly pulled it open, making me wince. I shone my light down the dark stairwell, my breath coming in short gasps. The thuds had stopped, but now I could hear shuffling noises. "Hello?" I called out weakly, my voice cracking. No response. I took a deep breath and started descending the stairs, gripping the railing tightly. Each step felt like an eternity as I made my way down. When I reached the bottom, I swept my light across the basement. That's when I saw them. Muddy footprints leading from the external basement door. My blood ran cold as I realized someone had broken in. The door was slightly ajar, a chilly breeze blowing through the gap. I was about to bolt back upstairs when a shadow moved in my peripheral vision. Before I could react, a hooded figure stepped out from behind a stack of boxes, completely blocking the stairway, my only escape route. I let out a strangled gasp and stumbled backwards, nearly dropping my phone. The intruder started advancing towards me slowly. In a panic, I dove behind an old couch in the corner, wedging myself into the small space between it and the wall. I could hear heavy footsteps approaching as I frantically dialed 911 with trembling fingers. When the operator answered, I could barely get the words out. "Please help," I whispered as quietly as I could. "Someone's broken into my house. I'm hiding in the basement. Please hurry." I gave her my address, trying to keep my voice steady as tears streamed down my face. Every tiny sound made me flinch. Creaking floorboards, rustling fabric. I was terrified the intruder would find me at any second. The 911 operator tried to keep me calm, telling me to stay hidden and that police were on the way. But those minutes of waiting felt like hours. I was shaking uncontrollably, struggling to breathe quietly. Suddenly, I heard sirens in the distance. The intruder must have heard them too, because there was a flurry of movement. Heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs, and I heard the front door slam. Even after the sirens got closer, I was too paralyzed with fear to move from my hiding spot. It wasn't until I heard voices calling out "police" that I finally found the courage to crawl out. "I'm down here," I yelled, my voice hoarse. 2 officers came rushing down the stairs, guns drawn. When they saw me huddled on the floor, they immediately holstered their weapons. "Are you all right?" one of them asked gently, kneeling beside me. I nodded mutely, still trembling. They helped me upstairs and sat me on the couch while they searched the house. My parents arrived home shortly after, having been contacted by the police. My mom held me tightly as I sobbed into her shoulder, the reality of what happened finally hitting me. The police found evidence of forced entry through the basement door. They took photos of the muddy footprints and dusted for fingerprints, but ultimately no arrests were ever made. The intruder had vanished into the night. In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled to feel safe in my own home. Every little noise made me jump. I couldn't sleep without the lights on. My parents installed a top-of-the-line security system, but it did little to ease my anxiety. Even now, years later, I still get chills thinking about that night. The terror of realizing someone was in the house, the heart-stopping moment when I saw that hooded figure, the agonizing wait in my hiding place, certain I was about to be discovered. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't been able to call 911, or if the police hadn't arrived when they did. The thought still haunts me. That night changed me forever. It shattered my sense of security and made me realize how quickly your whole world can be turned upside down. I'm more cautious now, always double-checking locks and being aware of my surroundings. Sometimes I still have nightmares about a dark figure chasing me through an endless basement. I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. In those moments, I'm right back there, a terrified 16-year-old girl hiding behind a couch, praying she won't be found. I don't know who that intruder was or what their intentions were. Part of me doesn't want to know, but I'll never forget the paralyzing fear of that night. It's a reminder of how fragile our safety can be and how quickly life can change in an instant. To this day, I can't go down into a basement alone. The sound of footsteps behind me makes my skin crawl, and I always check that the doors are locked before going to bed. That night in the basement may have only lasted an hour or so, but its effects have stayed with me for years. It's a stark reminder that sometimes the monsters we fear as children can become all too real as adults, and that the safety we take for granted can be shattered in a heartbeat. I'm sharing this story as a warning to others. Always be aware of your surroundings. Trust your instincts if something feels off, and never take your security for granted, because you never know when a quiet night at home could turn into your worst nightmare. It was supposed to be just another boring Friday night. My parents were heading out of town for the weekend, leaving me home alone for the first time. I was psyched to have the house to myself, already planning a Netflix binge and maybe inviting a few friends over. The weather forecast had mentioned a storm coming through, but I didn't think much of it. As evening fell, the wind picked up and rain started lashing against the windows. I curled up on the couch with some popcorn, settling in to watch a scary movie. Bad idea in hindsight. Around 10 p.m., the storm was in full force. Thunder boomed overhead as lightning illuminated the darkened house. The power had been flickering on and off, so I'd lit some candles for light. I was getting a bit creeped out being alone, so I texted my best friend Jess. "This storm is freaking me out. Wish you were here," she replied. "Aw, girl, I'd come over, but the roads are flooding. You'll be fine. Just don't answer the door for any axe murderers, lol." I laughed it off, but couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. The house seemed too quiet, too empty. Every creak of the old floorboards made me jump. I told myself I was being silly, letting the storm and movie get to me. Just as I was about to head upstairs to bed, I heard it. A loud, deliberate knock at the front door. My heart leapt into my throat. Who would be out in this weather? Maybe a neighbor needing help? I crept towards the entryway, peering through the peephole. Through the rain-streaked glass, I could make out a dark figure on the porch. They were wearing a hooded jacket, face obscured. "Hello," I called out nervously. "Can I help you?" No response, just another round of insistent knocking. "Who's there?" I tried again, voice shaking. Silence. Then suddenly, the doorknob started to rattle violently. Whoever it was, they were trying to force their way in. Panic seized me. This wasn't a neighbor in need. This was someone trying to break in. I scrambled backwards, fumbling for my phone with trembling hands. As I dialed 911, I heard a sickening crack. The old wooden door frame was starting to splinter. 911, what's your emergency? Someone's breaking into my house, I whispered frantically. Please hurry. I rattled off my address as I ran upstairs, looking for somewhere to hide. The dispatcher assured me help was on the way, but it felt like an eternity. I ducked into my parents' bedroom, wedging myself into their walk-in closet. I could hear heavy footsteps downstairs, moving from room to room. My chest felt tight, each breath a struggle as I tried to stay quiet. The storm raged on outside, wind howling and rain pelting the roof. I prayed the noise would mask any sounds I made, but it also meant I couldn't hear where the intruder was. Minutes ticked by, agonizingly slow. I clutched my phone, the 911 operator still on the line. She kept telling me to stay calm, that officers were almost there, but all I could focus on were those footsteps, getting closer and closer. Suddenly, the bedroom door creaked open. I clapped a hand over my mouth to stifle a sob. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating a shadowy figure in the doorway. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up from this nightmare. But the footsteps kept coming, slow and deliberate. The closet door rattled. I held my breath, frozen in terror. Just as the door began to open, I heard the most beautiful sound. Police sirens in the distance. The intruder must have heard them too. The footsteps retreated rapidly, thundering down the stairs. I stayed huddled in the closet, afraid to move until I heard voices calling out, "Police! Is anyone here?" Shakily, I emerged from my hiding spot. 2 officers were in the hallway, guns drawn. I burst into tears, the fear and adrenaline finally overwhelming me. They quickly secured the house, but the intruder was long gone. As I gave my statement, more details came to light. Apparently there had been a string of break-ins during storms lately. The guy would take advantage of the noise and darkness to force his way into homes. I found out later they caught him a few days after. Turns out he was a local lowlife with a history of burglary. But knowing that doesn't make me feel much safer. I still have nightmares about those footsteps coming closer, about what might have happened if the police hadn't shown up when they did. My parents came home early when they heard what happened. They've installed a security system now, but I'm not sure I'll ever feel truly safe here again. Every noise at night sends my heart racing. I keep reliving those terrifying moments, trapped and helpless as a stranger invaded my home. I know I'm lucky. It could have been so much worse. But I can't shake the lingering fear and paranoia. Will I ever be able to be alone in the house again? Will I always be looking over my shoulder? I'm trying to be strong, to not let this define me. But some nights, when the wind picks up and rain starts to fall, I'm right back in that closet, a scared kid wondering if she'll make it to morning. I don't know how long it will take to feel normal again. I just hope that sharing this might help someone else stay safe. Always trust your instincts, and never open the door if you're not sure who's there. You never know what evil might be lurking on the other side. It was around 8 p.m., and I was sprawled on the couch scrolling through TikTok when I first heard some odd noises coming from the hallway outside our apartment. At first, I didn't think much of it. In a big apartment building, you get used to hearing random sounds from neighbors. But as the noises continued and got louder, I started to feel uneasy. I muted my phone and listened closely. It sounded like someone stumbling around out there, bumping into walls. Then I heard a man's voice, mumbling incoherently. My heart started racing as I realized it was coming from right outside our door. Cautiously, I tiptoed over and looked through the peephole. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was our elderly neighbor, Mr. Davis, but he looked completely out of it. His gray hair was disheveled, his clothes were rumpled and askew. He was pacing back and forth in the hallway, gesturing wildly and talking to himself. I'd always known Mr. Davis as a quiet, polite man who mostly kept to himself. He lived alone in the apartment across from ours, and we'd exchange friendly hellos in passing. My parents had mentioned he had some health issues, but I never knew the details. Seeing him like this, it was like he was a completely different person. As I watched through the peephole, frozen in fear, Mr. Davis suddenly whirled around and locked eyes with me through the tiny glass circle. A chill ran down my spine. His eyes were wide and unfocused, with a manic gleam I'd never seen before. "Let me in," he shouted, slamming his palm against our door. "They're coming for me. I need to hide." I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding. What was happening? Why was he acting like this? "Please, I know you're in there," Mr. Davis yelled, his voice rising in panic. "Open the door. They'll find me." He started pounding on the door with both fists now. Each thunderous impact made me flinch. I was shaking uncontrollably, unsure what to do. Should I call my parents? The police? What if he managed to break in? "Go away," I finally managed to shout, my voice trembling. "I'm calling the police." But my words seemed to agitate him even more. He let out an anguished wail and threw his whole body against the door. The wood creaked ominously. "No police!" he screamed. "They're all in on it. Please, you have to help me." Tears were streaming down my face now as I backed away from the door. This couldn't be happening. Mr. Davis had always been so gentle and soft-spoken before. What could have caused such a drastic change? As he continued ranting and pounding, my mind raced. I vaguely remembered overhearing my parents discussing Mr. Davis's condition once, something about him needing to stay on his medication. With a sickening realization, I wondered if he'd stopped taking whatever meds he was on. I knew I needed to call for help, but I was terrified to speak and have Mr. Davis hear me. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone and retreated to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I could still hear him in the hallway, alternating between frantic pleas and angry demands to be let in. Huddled in the corner of my closet, I dialed 911 with trembling fingers. When the operator answered, I struggled to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation in a whisper. "Please hurry," I begged. "I'm home alone and I'm really scared." The operator assured me help was on the way and told me to stay hidden. Those next 10 minutes felt like an eternity. I cowered in the darkness of my closet, jumping at every sound. What if Mr. Davis somehow got inside before the police arrived? What would he do to me in his deranged state? Just when I thought I couldn't take the suspense any longer, I heard new voices in the hallway, male voices, firm and authoritative. The police had finally arrived. "Mr. Davis, this is the police. We need you to calm down and step away from the door." There was a commotion, sounds of a brief struggle, and Mr. Davis protesting loudly. Then everything went quiet. After a few minutes, there was a gentle knock at our apartment door. "Miss, this is Officer Johnson. It's safe to come out now. Are you all right?" Hesitantly, I emerged from my hiding place. My legs felt weak and shaky as I made my way to the front door. I opened it to find 2 police officers standing there, looking concerned. "Are you hurt? Did he manage to get inside at all?" one asked. I shook my head, still too rattled to speak much. They explained that they'd taken Mr. Davis into custody and were having him transported to the hospital for evaluation. Apparently, he'd stopped taking his psychiatric medication recently and had a psychotic episode. "You did the right thing by calling us," the officer said kindly. "I know that must have been very frightening for you." That was an understatement. Even after they left, I couldn't stop shaking. I called my parents and begged them to come home right away. I was too afraid to be alone in the apartment anymore. It's been a few weeks since that night, but I still have trouble sleeping. Every little noise in the hallway makes me jump. I know Mr. Davis is back on his meds now and has apologized profusely for what happened. My parents explained that he has schizophrenia and is usually stable when properly medicated. But I can't forget the crazed look in his eyes, the sound of his fists pounding on our door. I'm having nightmares and panic attacks. My parents are talking about therapy, which I'm open to. I just want to feel safe in my own home again. I never imagined something so terrifying could happen right here in our quiet apartment building. It's made me realize that you never truly know what's going on behind closed doors. I'm trying not to judge Mr. Davis too harshly. I know his actions that night weren't really him, but it's hard to reconcile the kind old man I thought I knew with the raving stranger who nearly broke down our door. I'm not sure I'll ever feel completely at ease around him again, and I definitely won't be staying home alone anytime soon. That one night changed everything. I keep replaying it in my mind, wondering what might have happened if the police hadn't arrived when they did. It's a chilling thought that I can't seem to shake. I know I should try to move past this, but it's not easy. The sound of footsteps in the hallway still makes my heart race. I find myself constantly checking that the door is locked. It's like a part of my sense of security has been permanently shattered. My parents are being really supportive and patient with me. They've offered to look into moving to a new building, but I'm not sure if that's the answer. I don't want to let this incident control my life. At the same time, I don't know how to stop feeling so afraid and vulnerable. I'm sharing this story as a reminder to always be aware of your surroundings and trust your instincts. If something feels off, don't hesitate to call for help. I'm grateful that I was able to stay calm enough to call 911 that night. Who knows what might have happened otherwise? I also hope this serves as a wake-up call about the importance of mental health awareness and treatment. Mr. Davis isn't a bad person. He just needed help. Maybe if there was less stigma around mental illness, situations like this could be prevented. For now, I'm taking things one day at a time. Some days are better than others. I'm working on feeling safe again, but I know it will be a long process. That one night changed my perspective on so many things. I just hope that sharing my experience might help someone else who finds themselves in a similar scary situation. Stay safe out there, and remember, you're stronger than you think. Even when you're terrified, you can find the courage to protect yourself. I never thought I'd be able to handle something like that, but I did. If I can get through it, you can too. Just don't be afraid to ask for help when you need it. The first day was amazing. I blasted music, ate junk food for every meal, and binge-watched shows my parents would never approve of. As night fell, I decided to have a mini spa night, face mask, painting my nails, the works. I was in the middle of giving myself a pedicure when I heard it. A soft but distinct knock at the front door. At first I thought I was imagining things. It was nearly midnight. Who would be knocking? But then it came again, a little louder this time. My heart started racing. I muted the TV and crept towards the entryway, my wet toenails leaving little marks on the hardwood floor. I peeked through the peephole, but it was too dark outside to see anything clearly. Just as I was about to call out and ask who was there, I saw a shadow move across the porch. It was tall and distinctly human-shaped. My blood ran cold. I backed away from the door, trying to calm my racing thoughts. It was probably just a neighbor, right? Maybe someone needed help. But something in my gut told me this wasn't right. Normal people don't show up unannounced at midnight. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. I could see the doorknob jiggling slightly. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone, ready to call my parents or the police. But before I could dial, the knocking stopped abruptly. For a moment, I stood frozen in the hallway, straining my ears for any sound. The silence was deafening. Then I heard footsteps. They were moving away from the front door, circling around the side of the house. Panic surged through me. I ran from window to window, locking everything I could find. As I reached the kitchen, I saw a figure through the back door. It was a person, dressed all in black, their face obscured by the darkness. They were hunched over the doorknob, and with a jolt of terror, I realized they were trying to pick the lock. I don't know where I found the presence of mind, but I managed to grab a kitchen knife and dial 911 with trembling fingers. The operator's calm voice was like a lifeline as I whispered my address and the situation. She told me help was on the way and to find a safe place to hide. I wedged myself into the tiny space between the fridge and the wall, clutching the knife so hard my knuckles turned white. From my hiding spot, I could see the back door. The lock was still jiggling, and I could hear the faint scraping of metal on metal. Every second felt like an eternity. I was certain the intruder would get in at any moment. I tried to control my breathing, terrified that even the slightest sound would give away my position. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard the most beautiful sound, police sirens in the distance. The noise at the door stopped immediately. Through the window, I saw the dark figure bolt across the backyard and disappear into the night. The next few hours were a blur. Police searching the property, taking my statement, calling my parents. They found signs of attempted forced entry at both the front and back doors. The officer praised me for staying calm and doing everything right, but I barely heard him. All I could think about was how close it had been. My parents came home early, of course. They were shaken and kept hugging me, telling me how brave I'd been. But I didn't feel brave. I felt violated, vulnerable, and terrified in my own home. In the days that followed, we installed a security system and new, stronger locks. My dad even talked about getting a dog, but none of it helped me sleep at night. Every creak of the house, every shadow outside my window made my heart race. The police never caught the guy. They said it was probably an opportunistic burglar who saw an easy target, a house with just a teenager home alone. But that explanation didn't ease my fears. Why had he been so persistent? Why try both doors? The questions haunted me. It's been years now, and I've mostly moved past it. But there are still nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, certain I've heard knocking at the door. The rational part of my brain knows it's just my imagination, but that primal fear is always there, lurking beneath the surface. I don't like being home alone anymore. Even now, living in my own apartment, I always double and triple check the locks before bed. I'm hyper-aware of my surroundings, especially at night. Some might call it paranoia, but I call it survival. That night changed me in ways I'm still discovering. It stole my sense of safety, my belief that bad things only happen to other people. But it also showed me how strong I could be when pushed to the limit. I survived, and that counts for something. Sometimes I wonder about that person in black. Who were they? What were their intentions? Did they move on to other houses, other victims? The not knowing is almost worse than the incident itself. I've tried therapy, meditation, even self-defense classes. They all help to some degree, but nothing can completely erase the memory of those terrifying hours. The sound of metal scraping against a lock still makes me freeze up. I often think about how differently things could have gone. What if I hadn't heard the first knock? What if the police had taken longer to arrive? The what-ifs can drive you crazy if you let them. My friends don't really understand. They try to be supportive, but unless you've experienced something like this, it's hard to grasp how it changes you. I've become the overly cautious one in the group, always checking exit routes and insisting on walking in well-lit areas. There are good days when I almost forget it ever happened. But then something small, a knock at the door, a shadow in the corner of my eye, brings it all rushing back. It's like my brain is stuck in a loop, constantly on alert for danger. I've tried to find meaning in what happened, to see it as a life lesson or a wake-up call. But sometimes I think it was just random, senseless evil that happened to intersect with my life for one terrifying night. The hardest part is knowing that the person who did this is still out there somewhere. They probably don't even remember that night, but it's shaped every aspect of my life since then. It's not fair, but I'm learning to live with it. I still love my childhood home, but it's different now. Every time I visit, I can't help but look at that back door and remember. It's like there's a before and after in my mind, with that night as the dividing line. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's to trust your instincts. That gut feeling that something wasn't right probably saved my life that night. I just wish I didn't have to learn that lesson in such a traumatic way. I'm sharing this story not for sympathy, but as a warning. It can happen to anyone, anywhere. Be aware, be prepared, and never take your safety for granted. Because in the blink of an eye, everything can change. The lodge itself was everything we'd hoped for. Rustic wooden beams, a massive stone fireplace, antique furniture that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. It had such a cozy, old-world charm. That first night we settled in with some hot cocoa by the fire, laughing and chatting about our plans for the week ahead. If only I'd known then how things would turn out. The next day started off great. We hit the slopes early, carving fresh tracks through powdery snow. But by afternoon, the weather took a turn. The wind picked up and snow started falling heavily. By evening, a full-on blizzard was raging outside. The lodge manager regretfully informed us that the roads were now impassable. We'd be stuck here until the storm passed. At first, we tried to make the best of it. We played board games, read books from the lodge's library, and enjoyed hearty meals prepared by the small kitchen staff. But as night fell and the storm showed no signs of letting up, an unsettling feeling began to creep over me. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild, but the old lodge suddenly felt different. Shadows seemed deeper, Creaks and groans from the wind sounded more ominous. I tried to shake it off, but couldn't quite get comfortable. That night I woke suddenly around 3 a.m. At first I wasn't sure why, but then I noticed how quiet it was. The howling wind had died down. As I lay there in the darkness, I had the distinct sensation of being watched. I turned my head slowly toward the bedroom door, and my blood ran cold. There, in the doorway, stood the figure of an old man. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, a worn tweed jacket, high-waisted trousers. But what struck me most was his face, pale, gaunt, with deeply sad eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I blinked hard, sure I must be dreaming. When I opened my eyes, he was gone. I barely slept the rest of the night. In the morning, I debated whether to tell the others. It all seemed so unreal in the light of day. I decided to keep it to myself for now, not wanting to freak everyone out. We were still stuck here after all, might as well try to enjoy it. But I couldn't shake the memory of those mournful eyes. Throughout the day, I kept seeing flashes of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. My friends noticed I seemed on edge, but I brushed it off as cabin fever. That night, we were gathered in the main lounge when the lights suddenly flickered and went out. We laughed nervously, fumbling for our phones to use as flashlights. As the warm glow of my screen illuminated the room, my laughter died in my throat. There, across the room, stood the old man. This time, I wasn't the only one who saw him. Anna screamed. David swore loudly. But before any of us could react further, he vanished. When the lights came back on moments later, we all stared at each other in shocked silence. "What the hell was that?" Owen finally said. None of us had an answer. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just shadows playing tricks on us. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen, and I knew it wasn't the first time. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I tossed and turned, jumping at every little sound. Around 2 a.m., I got up to use the bathroom. As I was washing my hands, I glanced up at the mirror and nearly had a heart attack. The old man was there, reflected behind me. I whirled around, but the bathroom was empty. Shaking, I hurried back to my room. As I approached my door, I saw him again, standing by the window at the end of the hallway, staring out at the snowy night. This time, he slowly turned to look at me. His lips moved, as if trying to speak, but no sound came out. Then he faded away like mist. I spent the rest of the night huddled under my covers, too terrified to sleep. When morning finally came, I knew I had to talk to someone. I found Margaret, one of the longtime staff members, alone in the kitchen. "Margaret," I said hesitantly, "does this place have any stories about ghosts or anything like that?" She paused in her work, giving me a long look. "Why do you ask?" I told her everything I'd seen. To my surprise, she didn't seem shocked. "This lodge has stood for over 100 years, she said quietly. "These mountains have claimed many lives in that time. Some say the spirits of those lost souls still linger here." A chill ran down my spine. "But why? What do they want?" Margaret shook her head sadly. "Who can say? Perhaps they're lost, unable to move on. Or maybe they're trying to warn us of something. The mountains can be treacherous." I spent the day on edge, jumping at every shadow. My friends were clearly unsettled too after what we'd all seen the night before. We tried to distract ourselves with games and conversation, but an oppressive atmosphere had settled over the lodge. That night, I lay awake for hours, dreading what might happen. Around midnight, the temperature in my room suddenly plummeted. My breath fogged in the air. Then, slowly, a figure began to materialize at the foot of my bed. It was him, the old man. This time he didn't disappear. He stood there, gazing at me with those haunted eyes. His lips moved again, desperately trying to communicate something. I was frozen in terror, unable to make a sound. He took a step closer, reaching out a pale, translucent hand. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying this was just a nightmare. When I opened them again, he was gone. But the room remained icy cold. I didn't sleep a wink that night. As soon as dawn broke, I went to find the others. They all looked as exhausted and freaked out as I felt. We agreed, ghost or no ghost, we couldn't stay here any longer. We pleaded with the manager to let us leave, even though the roads were still dangerous. He tried to convince us to wait another day, but we were adamant. We'd rather take our chances with the weather than spend another night in this place. The drive down the mountain was nerve-wracking, with icy roads and low visibility. But honestly, I felt safer facing a potential car crash than whatever was haunting that lodge. It's been weeks now, and I still can't shake the memory of that old man's sorrowful face. I've researched the history of the lodge, trying to find some explanation. There are stories of hikers and climbers who died in those mountains over the years. Was he one of them? What was he trying to tell me? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but one thing's for sure. I'm never going back to that lodge again. Some places are better left to their ghosts. Never been so terrified in my life. It's been weeks since that ski trip, but I still wake up in cold sweats, haunted by what happened up on that mountain. I keep replaying it all in my mind, trying to make sense of it, but I'm not sure I ever will. It was supposed to be an amazing vacation, me and 3 of my closest friends heading to this exclusive ski resort known for its stunning views and challenging runs. Natalie, Robert, John, and I had been planning the trip for months, excited to test our skills on some of the most difficult slopes we'd ever attempted. The first couple days were incredible. The resort lived up to all the hype: pristine powder, breathtaking vistas, luxurious amenities. We were having the time of our lives, laughing and joking as we conquered run after run. Looking back now, it all feels like a dream compared to the nightmare that was about to unfold. On the 3rd day, we decided to try one of the most difficult black diamond runs on the mountain. The weather forecast had called for some light snow, but nothing major. As we rode the lift to the summit, I remember noticing the sky starting to darken ominously. By the time we reached the top, visibility was dropping fast as snow began to fall more heavily. We probably should have turned back then and there, but we were feeling confident after our previous runs and figured we could handle it. God, how wrong we were. The 4 of us set off down the slope, sticking close together as best we could in the worsening conditions. The wind was howling, driving snow into our faces and making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I could barely make out Natalie and Robert's shapes in front of me as we carved our way down the mountain. That's when I realized I couldn't see John anymore. One minute he had been right behind me, and the next he was gone. I called out his name, but my voice was swallowed up by the roaring wind. Panic started to set in as I signaled to Natalie and Robert to stop. "Where's John?" I yelled, fighting to be heard over the storm. They looked around frantically, but there was no sign of him. We backtracked a bit, desperately scanning for any trace of our friend, but it was useless in the whiteout conditions. The storm was getting worse by the minute, and I could feel the cold starting to seep through my gear. We were in serious trouble. After what felt like an eternity of searching and shouting ourselves hoarse, We knew we had to find shelter before we all froze to death. Through some miracle, we stumbled across an old cabin tucked away in the woods off the main run. It looked abandoned, but it was our only option. We burst through the door, shaking off snow and trying to catch our breath. The cabin was dark and musty, clearly unused for years, but it was a refuge from the raging storm outside. As the adrenaline faded, the reality of our situation began to sink in. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere, in a blizzard, with no idea where John was or if he was even still alive. The next few hours were agonizing. We took turns venturing outside to search and call for John, but it was futile in the whiteout conditions. Each time we came back empty-handed, more defeated than before. I've never felt so helpless in my life. As night fell, the temperature plummeted even further. We huddled together for warmth, barely speaking, each lost in our own dark thoughts. I kept imagining John out there alone in the freezing darkness. The guilt was overwhelming. We never should have attempted that run in those conditions. Sometime in the early hours of the morning we heard it, a faint cry carried on the wind. We rushed outside, calling John's name. There was no response at first, but then we heard it again, closer this time. We plunged into the woods, following the sound. What we found still haunts me. John was huddled at the base of a tree, shivering uncontrollably. His eyes were wild with fear, darting around frantically. When we reached him, he started babbling incoherently about shadowy figures following him through the trees. They were everywhere, he kept saying, watching me, chasing me. Oh God, make it stop. We tried to calm him down as we helped him back to the cabin, but he was hysterical. Once inside, we wrapped him in blankets and tried to warm him up. Slowly, he became more lucid, but he was still clearly traumatized. As dawn broke, the storm finally began to subside. We knew we had to try to find our way back to the resort. John was in no condition to ski, so Robert fashioned a crude sled out of materials from the cabin. We set off, following what we hoped were our tracks from the day before. It was slow going, but eventually we spotted ski patrol in the distance. The relief I felt in that moment is indescribable. We were safe. We made it. Back at the resort, the staff seemed oddly unsurprised by our ordeal. As they checked us over, one of the older employees pulled me aside. "It's not the first time we've had folks get lost up there," he said in a low voice, "especially in that area by the old cabin. There are stories, legends about the mountain, things that can't be explained." I pressed him for details, but he just shook his head and walked away. It's been weeks now, and I still can't shake the feeling that there's more to what happened than just getting lost in a storm. John refuses to talk about it at all. Sometimes I catch him staring off into the distance with that same terrified look in his eyes. I don't know if I'll ever go skiing again. The mountains don't feel the same anymore. There's a darkness there, something ancient and unknowable. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling, I swear I can hear whispers carried on the breeze, calling me back to that God-forsaken mountain. My friends Alex, Maria, Mike, and I had been planning this trip for months. We were all stressed from work and wanted to get away from the city for a long weekend. Alex found this secluded cabin in the mountains online. It looked perfect. Quiet, surrounded by nature, no cell service. A true escape. We arrived on Friday afternoon after a long drive up winding mountain roads. The cabin was even more isolated than we expected. No other houses in sight, just dense forest all around. It was beautiful though. Rustic log cabin, wraparound porch, a little fire pit out front. We spent that first day settling in, hiking around the property, and grilling out on the deck. As night fell, we built a bonfire and sat around drinking beers, laughing and telling stories. It felt so good to be away from it all. The weather forecast had mentioned possible storms, but we weren't too worried. Around midnight, we started hearing distant rumbles of thunder. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees. We decided to head inside and continue hanging out in the cozy living room. That's when things started to get weird. It was probably around 1 a.m. when we heard the first knock. 3 sharp raps on the front door. We all froze, looking at each other. Who the hell could that be, way out here in the middle of nowhere? Mike went to check, but there was no one there. Just darkness and the sound of wind and rain. We laughed it off nervously, probably just a branch hitting the door or something. But then it happened again, this time at the back door. The same 3 loud knocks. Maria went to look this time. Again, nothing there. We were starting to get freaked out. Alex suggested it was probably just the wind, or maybe some animal. But it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. We tried to distract ourselves by putting on a movie, but we were all on edge. Every creak of the old cabin made us jump. The knocking continued sporadically over the next hour, sometimes at the front door, sometimes the back. Always in that same pattern, 3 sharp raps. We'd take turns checking, but there was never anyone there. No footprints in the mud outside. Nothing. Around 2:30 a.m. things escalated. We heard what sounded like heavy footsteps on the roof, slow, deliberate steps moving across the ceiling above us. But that was impossible. The roof was way too steep for anyone to walk on, especially in this storm. Maria was in tears at this point. Mike was trying to act tough, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Alex kept insisting there had to be a logical explanation, but his voice was shaky. I suggested we try to call for help, but of course there was no cell service. The landline was dead too. We were completely cut off. The footsteps continued overhead, back and forth. Sometimes they'd stop for a while, then start up again. It was maddening. We huddled together in the living room, too terrified to split up or go to our bedrooms. Around 3 a.m., the knocking changed. Instead of 3 distinct knocks, it became a continuous pounding, loud, insistent, almost angry sounding, and it was coming from every door and window simultaneously. The noise was deafening. We covered our ears, screaming at each other but barely able to hear. The whole cabin seemed to shake with the force of it. This went on for what felt like hours. We were beyond terrified, convinced we were about to die. I remember thinking that if whatever was out there broke in, I didn't even want to see what it was. I just wanted it to be over quickly. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was almost as shocking as the noise had been. We sat there frozen, ears ringing, waiting for it to start again. But it didn't. As dawn broke, the storm passed. Pale light filtered through the windows. We were afraid to move at first, but eventually we worked up the courage to look outside. There was no sign of anything unusual, no footprints, no damage to the doors or windows, just wet leaves and mud from the storm. We packed up our stuff in record time and got the hell out of there. The drive back down the mountain was tense and silent. None of us knew what to say. We debated whether to report it to the police. In the end, we decided to stop at the local sheriff's office. The deputy listened patiently to our story, but I could tell he didn't believe us. He said he'd send someone out to check the property, but I doubt they ever did. It's been 3 months now, and I still don't know what to make of that night. Was it all in our heads somehow? Some kind of shared hallucination brought on by isolation and the storm? Or was there really something out there, something that wanted in? I've tried researching the history of the area, looking for similar stories or legends. but I haven't found anything concrete. Just vague tales of hikers going missing over the years, strange lights in the forest. Nothing that explains what we experienced. My friends and I don't talk about it much. I think we're all trying to forget, to convince ourselves it wasn't real. But I know what I heard, what I felt. The sheer terror of knowing something was out there, wanting to get to us. I haven't been camping or to any remote areas since then. I'm not sure I ever will again. The rational part of my brain says it was just a bizarre, one-time thing. But late at night, when I hear the wind outside my window, I can't help but listen for those 3 sharp knocks. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, I'm not sure I believe it myself most days. But I know what happened that night was real. And I know I'll never forget the feeling of utter helplessness and fear as we huddled in that cabin, waiting for whatever was out there to break in. Sometimes I wonder if we made the right choice by leaving. Part of me wishes we had stayed, tried to get to the bottom of it. But the rest of me is just grateful we made it out alive. I still have nightmares about those footsteps on the roof, about the pounding that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, convinced I'm back in that cabin. I've tried talking to a therapist about it, but it's hard to explain. How do you describe a fear so primal, so all-consuming, to someone who wasn't there? How do you make them understand the terror of being trapped, isolated, with something unknowable trying to get in? I've gone over that night 1,000 times in my head, trying to find some explanation. Could it have been other people playing an elaborate prank? But how would they have made those sounds on the roof? And why would anyone go to such lengths in the middle of a storm, miles from anywhere? Was it some kind of animal? But what animal knocks in patterns or makes sounds like footsteps on a roof? And how could it have created that simultaneous pounding from all directions? The more I think about it, the less sense it makes. And that's what scares me the most. The idea that there are things out there beyond our understanding. Things that can't be explained by logic or reason. I know this sounds crazy. Trust me, I know. If someone had told me this story before it happened, I would have thought they were making it up or exaggerating. But I swear on everything I hold dear, this is what we experienced that night. I'm not sure why I'm sharing this now. Maybe I'm hoping someone out there has had a similar experience and can shed some light on what happened. Or maybe I just need to get it off my chest to feel like I'm not crazy for still being affected by this months later. All I know is that night changed me. It shook my understanding of reality and what's possible in this world. And it left me with a lingering fear that I can't seem to shake. So if you're planning a trip to a remote cabin anytime soon, my advice is this. Make sure you have a way to call for help. And if you hear knocking in the middle of the night, don't answer. Just don't answer. My buddies and I had been planning this ski trip for months. We were all pretty experienced skiers, always chasing that next adrenaline rush on the slopes. When we heard about this secluded resort deep in the Rockies, it seemed perfect. Challenging runs, breathtaking scenery, and far from the tourist crowds. The first few days were amazing. The powder was incredible, and we were having a blast tearing up the mountain. But on the third night, things took a weird turn. We were hanging out in the lodge, warming up by the fire after a long day on the slopes. This older guy who worked there overheard us talking about some of the tougher runs and started telling us about the mountain's history. "You boys better be careful out there," he said, his eyes getting all serious. "These mountains have claimed more than a few lives over the years." We laughed it off at first, figuring he was just trying to spook us. But then he told us about this skier who vanished without a trace back in the 60s. Apparently, the guy went out for a nighttime run during a storm and was never seen again. Search parties combed the mountain for weeks, but never found a body or any sign of what happened to him. "Some say his spirit still haunts these slopes," the old-timer finished with a knowing look. We rolled our eyes and headed up to our rooms, joking about ghost skiers. But I gotta admit, the story stuck with me. As I was drifting off to sleep, I kept picturing some poor lost soul wandering the mountain for eternity. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of howling wind. A storm had blown in while we were sleeping, and snow was coming down hard outside the window. As I laid there listening to the wind, I started to feel weirdly anxious. Something just felt off. I got up to use the bathroom, and as I was heading back to bed, I glanced out the window. That's when I saw them, ski tracks in the fresh snow, leading from the lodge toward the dark tree line. My heart started racing. Who the hell would be crazy enough to go out in this weather? I don't know what possessed me, but I felt this overwhelming urge to follow those tracks. I quickly threw on my gear and headed outside. The wind hit me like a wall of ice as soon as I stepped out. Visibility was terrible, but I could just make out the tracks in the glow of the porch light. I followed them across the empty ski run, my legs sinking deep into the powder with each step. As I got closer to the trees, doubt started creeping in. What was I doing out here? This was insane. But I'd come this far, and curiosity pushed me forward. The tracks led into a clearing just inside the tree line, and that's where they stopped. Just ended in the middle of the clearing. I stood there, confused and shivering, wondering if I was losing my mind. Then I saw him. He materialized out of the darkness about 20 feet away. A man, dressed in old-fashioned ski gear, the kind you'd see in pictures from the 60s. He was semi-transparent, like a projection, and had this vacant 1,000-yard stare. My blood ran cold as I realized I was looking at a ghost. I wanted to run, but I was frozen in place. The ghost skier slowly turned his head and locked eyes with me. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of loss and despair wash over me. It was like I could feel everything he'd experienced: the fear, the cold, the slow realization that he was going to die alone on this mountain. And then, in the blink of an eye, he was gone, vanished into the swirling snow. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few seconds, before my survival instincts finally kicked in. I turned and ran as fast as I could back toward the lodge, not daring to look back. I burst into our room, waking up my friends. They thought I'd lost it when I tried to explain what happened. I was babbling about ghosts and tracks in the snow. They assumed I'd had some kind of vivid nightmare. "Dude, you've been in bed all night," my roommate insisted. "I got up to pee an hour ago and you were sound asleep." But I knew what I'd seen. I begged them to come outside with me, to see the tracks for themselves. They reluctantly agreed, probably to humor me. But when we got out there, the tracks were gone. The storm had covered any trace of them. My friends were worried about me. They thought maybe the altitude was messing with my head, or that I'd had some kind of episode. I almost started to believe them, but then I noticed the time. Over 2 hours had passed since I first woke up. There was no way I'd imagined all of that. I barely slept the rest of the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that ghost's empty stare. The next morning, my buddies wanted to hit the slopes, but I just couldn't do it. The thought of being out there, wondering if that spirit was watching me, made me feel sick. I spent the day in the lodge, obsessively researching the story of the missing skier. There wasn't much online, just a few old newspaper clippings, but the details matched up eerily well with what the old-timer had told us. A 28-year-old man named Jack Hollister had gone missing during a night ski on February 13, 1964. The article mentioned he was last seen wearing a red and black ski jacket, exactly what the ghost I saw was wearing. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence, that my mind had filled in details from the story I'd heard. But deep down, I knew the truth. I'd seen something that night that defied explanation. The rest of the trip was a blur. I made up excuses to stay off the mountain, claiming I'd caught a bug. My friends were confused and a little pissed that I was bailing on them, but I just couldn't shake the fear. Every time I looked at those slopes, I imagined Jack Hollister's spirit wandering in the darkness. On the last night, I woke up again to the sound of wind. For a moment, I was gripped by the irrational fear that the ghost was outside our window, waiting for me. I pulled the covers over my head like a little kid and didn't move until morning. We left the next day, and I've never been so relieved to leave a place in my life. My buddies chalked the whole thing up to altitude sickness or something, but they could tell it had really shaken me. We don't talk about that trip much anymore. It's been 5 years, and I haven't been back to that resort. Hell, I barely ski at all these days. Every time I think about strapping on my boots, I remember those glowing tracks in the snow and that empty-eyed specter. I know how crazy this all sounds. Believe me, I've spent countless nights trying to rationalize what happened, but I know what I saw out there in that storm. And I can't shake the feeling that Jack Hollister is still out there, endlessly searching for a way off that mountain. Sometimes, when the wind is howling outside my window on a cold winter night, I wonder, is he still waiting for someone to follow those tracks? And what would have happened if I'd stayed out there just a little longer? I don't think I'll ever know the answers, but one thing's for sure. I'm never setting foot on that mountain again. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. It all started when my family moved into our new house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. I was 16 at the time, and my little brother Jake was 10. Our parents were so excited about the move. They kept going on about how it was the perfect place to raise a family with good schools and friendly neighbors. At first, I was bummed about leaving my old friends behind, but I have to admit, the new house was pretty cool. It was way bigger than our old place, with an attic and everything. The first couple of weeks after we moved in were pretty normal. We were all busy unpacking boxes and getting settled. My mom was obsessed with decorating and making the place feel like home. My dad dove into a bunch of home improvement projects. Jake and I were focused on setting up our new rooms. But then weird little things started happening. Food would go missing from the pantry or fridge. Not a lot, just enough that we'd notice and wonder if someone had eaten it. My mom kept accusing my dad of midnight snacking, which he denied. We'd find cabinets or drawers open that we could have sworn we'd closed. The toilet seat would be up when all the guys in the house swore they'd put it down. At first we all just brushed it off. New house jitters, forgetfulness from the stress of moving, that kind of thing. But then I started hearing noises at night, creaks and thumps coming from above my room. I told my parents, but they said it was probably just the house settling, or maybe squirrels in the attic. I tried to believe them, but the noises kept happening. and they didn't sound like squirrels to me. It was more like footsteps. Slow, careful footsteps of someone trying not to be heard. I started having trouble sleeping. I'd lie awake at night, straining my ears, convinced I could hear someone moving around up there. During the day, I'd find myself staring at the attic access in the hallway ceiling, wondering what was up there. A couple times I worked up the courage to pull down the ladder and peek my head up, shining a flashlight around. But I never saw anything out of the ordinary, just boxes and old junk the previous owners had left behind. Things came to a head about 2 months after we'd moved in. It was a Friday night, and my parents had gone out to dinner, leaving me in charge of Jake. We ordered pizza and were hanging out watching movies in the living room. Around 10 p.m., Jake fell asleep on the couch. I was starting to doze off too when I heard it. Unmistakable footsteps coming from upstairs. My blood ran cold. Jake was asleep right next to me. My parents were out. There was someone else in the house. I sat frozen for a few minutes, straining my ears. The footsteps had stopped, but then I heard a floorboard creak. Whoever it was, they were being careful, but not careful enough. I knew I should call 911, but for some reason I didn't. Maybe it was teenage bravado, or maybe I was just in shock. Instead, I gently shook Jake awake and whispered for him to be very quiet and go hide in the downstairs bathroom. He must have sensed my fear because he didn't argue, just nodded with wide eyes and tiptoed away. Heart pounding, I grabbed a baseball bat from the hall closet and crept up the stairs. The house was dead silent now. I checked all the bedrooms, empty. That left only one place, the attic. I stood at the base of the pull-down ladder, bat clutched in sweaty hands, trying to work up the courage to climb up. What if I was wrong? What if it really was just the house settling or animals? I'd feel like an idiot. But deep down, I knew. I knew someone was up there. Taking a deep breath, I started up the ladder. As my head cleared the opening, I fumbled for the light switch. The bare bulb flickered to life, illuminating the cluttered space. And there he was. A man was crouched in the far corner, partially hidden behind some boxes. He was filthy, with matted hair and a scraggly beard. His eyes were wide with fear, or maybe madness. For a long moment, we just stared at each other in shock. Then he spoke, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Please, don't tell anyone I'm here. I have nowhere else to go." I was too terrified to speak. 1,000 questions raced through my mind. How long had he been up here? What had he seen? What had he done while we slept? He must have sensed my panic because he started babbling. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean any harm. I just needed a place to stay. I've been careful, I swear. I only come down at night to get food. Please, you can't tell anyone." I found my voice then, anger overcoming fear. Get out right now, or I'm calling the police." He nodded frantically and started gathering up a small pile of belongings, some ragged clothes, an old backpack. I backed down the ladder, bat still raised as he followed. When he reached the bottom, I pointed to the front door. "Go, now, and don't ever come back." He practically ran out the door. I slammed it behind him and locked it, then collapsed against it, shaking. Jake came out of the bathroom then, looking scared and confused. I hugged him tight and called our parents. The police came that night. They searched the attic and the rest of the house but found no sign of the man. They dusted for prints and took our statements. My parents were horrified. Jake was too young to fully understand, but he picked up on everyone's fear and stress. We learned later that the man was homeless and had likely been living in the attic since before we even moved in. The previous owners had left the house vacant for a few months, and he must have found a way in then. He'd been careful to only move around at night and take small amounts of food. Who knows how long he might have stayed if I hadn't caught him. We couldn't bear to stay in that house after that, knowing that a stranger had been living above us, watching us for months. It was too much. We sold the house and moved again, this time to an apartment with tight security. It's been almost a year now, but I still have nightmares about that night. I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear footsteps above me. Sometimes I find myself checking closets and under beds, just to be sure. I don't think I'll ever feel truly safe in my own home again. The illusion of security has been shattered. I know now that danger can lurk in the most unexpected places, even right above your head while you sleep. So I stay vigilant, always listening, always watching, because you never know who might be watching you back. Never believed in ghosts or the supernatural until we moved into that old Victorian house on Maple Street. It was supposed to be our dream home, spacious, full of character, and at a price we could actually afford. My husband Tom and I were thrilled when our offer was accepted. We thought we'd hit the jackpot. The first few days after moving in were hectic but exciting. We were busy unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and exploring all the nooks and crannies of our new home. The kids were having a blast running up and down the creaky old staircase and playing hide and seek in all the closets and crawl spaces. It wasn't until about a week after we'd moved in that I started noticing odd things. At first, it was just little stuff that I could easily explain away. A door I could have sworn I'd closed would be wide open. I'd put something down and then find it in a completely different spot later. I chalked it up to absent-mindedness or the kids playing pranks. But then things started escalating. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps coming from the attic above our bedroom. Tom was fast asleep next to me. I lay there frozen, my heart pounding, as I listened to the slow, deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth overhead. After what felt like an eternity, they finally stopped. I was too terrified to go investigate. The next morning over breakfast, I casually asked the kids if either of them had gotten up in the night and gone to the attic. They both looked at me like I was crazy and said no. I tried to convince myself it had just been a vivid dream. A few days later, I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I heard a loud crash from the living room. I rushed in to find a framed family photo that had been hanging on the wall, now lying shattered on the floor, all the way across the room. There's no way it could have just fallen and landed there. It was as if someone had angrily thrown it. I was seriously starting to freak out, but I still didn't want to jump to any crazy conclusions. I decided to do some research into the history of the house, hoping to find a rational explanation for the weird occurrences. That's when I discovered the old diary in the back of a kitchen cupboard. The faded leather cover was embossed with the name Eleanor Blackwood. As I began to read, my blood ran cold. The diary belonged to a young woman who had lived in the house in the 1920s. Her entries started out normal enough, talking about daily life and her hopes and dreams. But as I read on, things took a dark turn. Eleanor wrote about strange noises in the night, objects moving on their own, and an oppressive feeling of being watched. She became convinced the house was haunted and that something evil wanted to harm her. The entries grew more frantic and paranoid. The final entry, dated June 15, 1924, simply said, "It won't let me leave. God help me." I slammed the diary shut, my hands shaking. Everything Eleanor had described matched exactly what we'd been experiencing. I wanted so badly to dismiss it as the ramblings of a mentally unstable woman, but deep down I knew she was telling the truth. That night, things went from bad to worse. We were all in the living room watching TV when suddenly every light in the house went out simultaneously. Before we could even react, an ear-splitting shriek echoed through the house. It didn't sound human. The kids started crying and clinging to us in terror. Then, in the dim light coming through the windows, I saw it. A figure, translucent and glowing faintly, standing at the foot of the stairs. It was a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her long hair flowing as if underwater. She slowly turned to face us, revealing a gaunt face with hollow eyes. I recognized her immediately from a photo in the diary. It was Eleanor. The apparition began to drift up the stairs, still facing us. As she ascended, objects started flying off shelves and hurling themselves across the room. Picture frames rattled on the walls. That horrible shrieking sound continued. We ran. We didn't even stop to grab anything. We just bolted out the front door and piled into the car. As Tom peeled out of the driveway, I looked back at the house. Eleanor's ghostly face was visible in the attic window, watching us flee. We drove straight to a hotel and didn't go back to the house for days. When we finally worked up the courage to return and pack up our belongings, everything was eerily still and quiet, but the air felt heavy, oppressive, as if something was lying in wait, biding its time. We sold the house as quickly as we could, taking a huge financial hit. I still feel guilty about not warning the new owners. But who would believe us? Sometimes I drive by the old place, wondering if Eleanor is still there, waiting for her next victims. I pray we were the last family to endure her wrath. I don't know why Eleanor's spirit is trapped in that house, or what tragic event caused her to become such a malevolent presence. All I know is that I'll never doubt the existence of ghosts again. Some things simply can't be explained by logic or reason. There are dark forces in this world that are beyond our understanding. We've tried to move on with our lives and put the whole terrifying ordeal behind us, but I still have nightmares about Eleanor's haunting face. I wake up in a cold sweat, half expecting to see her standing at the foot of my bed. The kids still get scared at night sometimes, saying they hear whispers or footsteps. I often wonder if we did the right thing by just running away. Should we have tried to help Eleanor's spirit find peace somehow? But the threat to our family felt so immediate and overwhelming. In that moment of sheer terror, all I could think about was getting my children to safety. Sometimes I'm tempted to go back, to try to uncover the full truth about what happened to Eleanor and why she's still there. But then I remember the pure malevolence I felt emanating from her spirit, and I know it's better to stay far away. Whatever is keeping her in that house, it's not something that wants to be disturbed. I've tried talking to a few paranormal experts and mediums about our experience. Most of them just wanted to capitalize on the story or dismissed it entirely. But one elderly psychic listened intently and then warned me never to return to that house. She said the energy there was far darker and more dangerous than a typical haunting. So we've tried our best to put it all behind us and move on. But I know I'll never forget those terrifying nights in Eleanor's house. The scratching sounds in the walls, objects moving by themselves, that bone-chilling shriek, and worst of all, Eleanor's ghostly face watching us from the shadows. I can only hope that someday her tortured spirit will find peace. But a part of me fears she'll be trapped in that house forever, taking out her anger and pain on every family unlucky enough to move in. All I can do is warn others to be careful. You never know what darkness may be lurking in an old house with a tragic history. I've never felt so violated and terrified in my own home. It all started about 6 months ago when we moved into our new house in what seemed like a quiet, friendly neighborhood. At first, everything was perfect. We were settling in nicely, getting to know the neighbors, and felt like we'd found our forever home. Our next-door neighbor, Mr. Higgins, was an elderly man who lived alone. He seemed harmless enough at first, just a lonely old guy who would wave from his porch or make small talk when we were out in the yard. We tried to be friendly, bringing him some homemade cookies when we first moved in and helping him take his trash cans to the curb occasionally. But then things started to get weird. I began noticing Mr. Higgins watching us from his windows a lot, like all the time. Whenever I looked over, I'd catch a glimpse of him quickly ducking away from the curtains. At first I brushed it off, figuring he was just bored and curious about the new neighbors. But it kept happening over and over to the point where I started feeling really uncomfortable. Then we started finding little gifts left on our porch or in our yard, random trinkets, old photographs, pages torn from books. Just odd stuff that made no sense. When I asked Mr. Higgins about it, he acted confused and denied leaving anything. But I just knew it had to be him. Things escalated quickly from there. One morning I went out to get the mail and found dozens of cut-out newspaper articles about missing persons cases scattered all over our front lawn. Another day, all of our potted plants had been rearranged into bizarre patterns. We started finding weird symbols carved into trees in our backyard. I was getting seriously freaked out at this point and insisted we install security cameras. The footage we captured was chilling. Night after night, it showed Mr. Higgins creeping around our property, peering in windows, touching things, leaving his little gifts. He seemed to be growing bolder, staying longer each time. We called the police, but since he hadn't actually broken in or directly threatened us, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested we try talking to him or his family members, but Mr. Higgins had no family that we knew of, and whenever we tried to confront him, he'd just smile vacantly and act like he had no idea what we were talking about. I started having trouble sleeping, jumping at every little noise. My husband insisted on upgrading our alarm system and installing more cameras and motion sensor lights. But nothing seemed to deter Mr. Higgins. If anything, our attempts to beef up security just seemed to intrigue him more. Then came the night that still gives me nightmares. I woke up around 3 a.m. to get a glass of water. As I was heading back upstairs, movement caught my eye through the living room window. I froze in terror as I saw Mr. Higgins' face pressed right up against the glass, staring in at me with wide, unblinking eyes. I screamed and ran to wake up my husband. By the time we got back downstairs, Mr. Higgins was gone. We called the police again, but of course there was no sign of him when they arrived. They took a report and promised to keep an eye on things, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. I was a nervous wreck after that, barely sleeping and constantly on edge. A few nights later, it all came to a horrifying climax. I jolted awake around midnight to the sound of breaking glass downstairs. Heart pounding, I shook my husband awake, and we crept to the top of the stairs. We could hear shuffling noises and muttering coming from the living room. With shaking hands, I dialed 911 as my husband grabbed a baseball bat and started slowly descending the stairs. Suddenly, Mr. Higgins appeared at the bottom, grinning maniacally up at us. He was muttering nonsensically and waving around a large kitchen knife. "You can't hide from me anymore," he snarled. "I know what you really are. I have to stop you before it's too late." He started lurching up the stairs towards us. My husband yelled at him to stay back and swung the bat menacingly. I was frozen in terror, clinging to my phone as the 911 operator assured me help was on the way. Just as Mr. Higgins reached the top of the stairs, sirens blared in the distance. He hesitated for a moment, then turned and bolted back down and out the broken window he'd entered through. The police arrived moments later, but he had vanished into the night. The next few hours were a blur of police statements, evidence collection, and rising panic as they searched for Mr. Higgins. They finally found him hours later, huddled in his basement surrounded by newspaper clippings, photos of our family, and scrawled writings that made no sense. It turns out Mr. Higgins suffered from severe mental illness and had gone off his medication months ago. In his delusional state, he'd somehow fixated on us as a threat that needed to be eliminated. The gifts and stalking behavior were part of his warped attempt to gather evidence against us. He was taken into custody and is now in a psychiatric facility, but the damage was done. We couldn't bear to stay in that house anymore, constantly reliving the terror of that night. We moved away as soon as we could, but I still have nightmares about Mr. Higgins's face in the window, his manic grin as he came up those stairs. I'm sharing this as a warning to trust your instincts if something feels off about a neighbor or situation. We ignored so many red flags, not wanting to seem paranoid or judgmental. If we'd taken action sooner, maybe things wouldn't have escalated to such a terrifying point. I'm still jumpy and paranoid in our new home. Every creaky floorboard or shadow makes my heart race. I check and recheck the locks obsessively. I know Mr. Higgins can't hurt us anymore, but the fear lingers. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again after what we went through. The idea that someone could invade not just our home, but our sense of security and peace of mind in such a profound way is something I'm still struggling to process. Sometimes I find myself wondering about Mr. Higgins, if he's getting the help he needs, if he even understands what he did to us. Part of me feels sorry for him, knowing he was driven by illness rather than malice. But then I remember the wild look in his eyes that night, the knife in his hand, and the sympathy evaporates. I try to remind myself that what happened to us was a freak occurrence, that most people aren't secret psychopaths waiting to terrorize their neighbors. But it's hard to shake the feeling that danger could be lurking anywhere, even in the most seemingly safe and normal places. For now, we're taking it day by day. Therapy has helped some. We're slowly getting to know our new neighbors, though I can't help but analyze their every word and action for signs of something sinister lurking beneath the surface. I know that's not fair or healthy, but the fear is hard to shake. If there's one silver lining, it's that this experience has brought my family closer together. We appreciate each other and our safety so much more now. We don't take peaceful moments for granted anymore. But I still find myself lying awake some nights, listening intently for any sign of intrusion, half expecting to see Mr. Higgins's face appear at the window. I don't know how long it will take before those fears fade. All I can do is hope that time and distance will eventually heal these psychological wounds, and that one day I'll be able to feel truly at peace in my own home again. The first few weeks after moving in were blissful. Kelly and I spent our evenings painting rooms, arranging furniture, and dreaming about our future together in this house. We felt so lucky to have found such a beautiful home that we could grow old in. But then the strange occurrences started. At first, it was just little things, items being moved around when we were sure we hadn't touched them, unexplained noises at night. We brushed it off as just being in an unfamiliar place. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of someone walking around downstairs. My heart started racing as I gently shook Kelly awake. "There's someone in the house," I whispered urgently. We called 911 and hid in our closet, terrified. When the police arrived, they searched the entire property but found no signs of forced entry. They assured us it was probably just the house settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. A few days later, I came home from work to find our living room completely rearranged. The couch was on the opposite wall, pictures were taken down, even our bookshelf had been reorganized. Kelly swore she hadn't done it. We were both bewildered and increasingly uneasy. Things escalated quickly after that. We'd come home to find doors we were certain we'd locked standing wide open. Our mail started disappearing from the mailbox. One morning we woke up to find all the kitchen cabinets open and their contents strewn across the floor. We were at our wits' end, constantly on edge in our own home. The police seemed skeptical of our claims, hinting that we might be doing these things ourselves for attention. It was infuriating and terrifying to not be believed. Then came the night that changed everything. Kelly and I were in bed when we heard a loud crash downstairs. Before we could react, heavy footsteps came pounding up the stairs. Our bedroom door flew open and there stood a disheveled older man, wild-eyed and screaming, "Get out of my house!" I leapt out of bed, putting myself between Kelly and this intruder. He lunged at me, raving about how we were trespassers and thieves. I managed to wrestle him to the ground while Kelly called 911. It was the longest few minutes of my life, struggling to restrain this deranged man as he fought and yelled incoherently. When the police finally arrived, they recognized the man as Greg Thompson, a former resident of our house who had been institutionalized for severe mental health issues. Apparently, he had recently been released and had fixated on the idea that our house still belonged to him. Learning this was both a relief and a new source of terror. On one hand, we finally had an explanation for all the strange occurrences. On the other, we realized we'd been living with a disturbed man breaking into our home for weeks. The police assured us Greg would be taken back into custody, but the damage was done. Our sense of safety in our own home was shattered. We couldn't sleep without checking and rechecking all the locks. Every creak and groan of the house sent us into a panic. We invested in an expensive security system, but it didn't ease our fears. I started having vivid nightmares of Greg breaking in again, unable to shake the memory of his crazed face as he burst into our bedroom. Kelly and I seriously considered selling the house and moving, but we'd poured all our savings into this place. Plus, we were angry. Why should we have to leave our dream home because of this man's delusions? We decided to stay and fight. We reached out to our neighbors, explaining the situation and asking them to keep an eye out for any suspicious activity. Their support was overwhelming. They helped us set up a neighborhood watch program and checked in on us regularly. Slowly, we started to reclaim our sense of security. We took self-defense classes together and made a pact to never let fear drive us from our home. It wasn't easy. There were still nights when every shadow seemed menacing, when we'd wake up in a cold sweat sure we'd heard someone in the house. But as weeks passed without incident, we began to relax. We focused on making happy memories in our home to overshadow the bad ones. We hosted dinner parties, planted a garden, and filled the house with laughter and love. Then, just as we thought we were past the worst of it, it happened again. I came home from work one day to find our front door wide open. My blood ran cold as I cautiously entered the house, calling out for Kelly. There was no answer. I searched room by room, my panic rising with each empty space. When I reached our bedroom, I found Kelly huddled in the closet, shaking and in tears. Greg had come back. He'd broken in while she was home alone, ranting about reclaiming his property. She'd managed to lock herself in the closet and call the police, but she was traumatized. This time, Greg was caught red-handed. He was arrested, and we were assured he'd be committed to a secure facility. But the damage was done. Kelly couldn't stand to be in the house alone anymore. We both started having severe anxiety and PTSD symptoms. It took months of therapy and support from our friends and family to start feeling safe again. We upgraded our security system, got a large dog, and even considered moving despite our attachment to the house. In the end, we decided to stay. We refused to let Greg's actions define our lives or our home. It wasn't easy, and there are still days when unexpected noises make us jump. But we're determined to create a life filled with joy and love in this house, in spite of everything that's happened. Our experience has changed us. There's no denying that. We're more cautious, more aware of our surroundings. But it's also made our relationship stronger. We've learned we can face anything together, that we're resilient in ways we never knew. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding. Sure, I've heard someone in the house, but then I feel Kelly next to me, hear her steady breathing, and I remember we're safe. We've reclaimed our home, our peace of mind, and our lives. Greg may have temporarily stolen our sense of security, but he couldn't take away our love for each other or our determination to build a happy life in our dream home. It's been a year now since the last incident. Our house is filled with new, happy memories that are slowly but surely outweighing the bad ones. We still have moments of fear, but they're becoming fewer and farther between. We're healing, we're moving forward, and we're doing it together in the home we fought so hard to make our own. It all started so normally. Claire and I had been planning this luxury cruise for months, saving up and dreaming about sipping cocktails by the pool. When we first boarded the massive ship, we were in awe of how fancy everything was. The chandeliers, the marble floors, the endless buffets. That first day was perfect. We lounged by the pool, got massages at the spa, and stuffed ourselves silly at dinner. As night fell, we decided to check out one of the ship's many bars. The bartender was mixing up some kind of blue tropical drink that looked amazing. "I'll be right back. Just need to use the restroom," Claire said, sliding off her bar stool. I nodded, scrolling through my phone as I waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. After 15 minutes, I started to get a bit worried. The bathrooms weren't that far away. I texted her but got no response. "Hey, have you seen my friend? Blonde hair, blue dress?" I asked the bartender. He shook his head. My heart started to race as I hurried to the restroom to check for her. Empty. I ran back out, scanning the crowded bar. No sign of Claire anywhere. "Claire," I called out, probably a little too loudly. People turned to stare. I didn't care. Something was wrong. Claire would never just wander off without telling me. I spent the next hour frantically searching every inch of that massive ship I could access. I checked all the bars, restaurants, the casino, the theater. Nothing. By this point, I was in full panic mode. I found a crew member and explained the situation, my voice shaking. "My friend is missing. She went to the bathroom over an hour ago and never came back. Please, you have to help me find her." The crewman tried to reassure me, saying she had probably just lost track of time somewhere on the ship. But I could tell from his eyes that he was concerned too. Soon I was sitting in the security office, shaking as I described Claire to stone-faced men in uniforms. They asked endless questions. What was she wearing? When did I last see her? Had she been drinking? Did she have any reason to want to leave? As the hours ticked by with no sign of Claire, I felt like I was losing my mind. How could someone just vanish on a ship? There was nowhere for her to go. The security team searched every public area, then started going through private cabins. I couldn't stop imagining horrible scenarios. Had she fallen overboard? Been kidnapped? Murdered? It was nearing 3 a.m. when I overheard 2 security guards talking in low voices. Check the maintenance areas again. Sometimes stowaways hide down there. Stowaways? My exhausted brain latched onto this new possibility. Without really thinking it through, I slipped away from the security office and made my way to a service elevator I'd spotted earlier. The lower decks were like a maze of identical white corridors. I had no idea where I was going, just driven by pure desperation to find Claire. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I jogged down hallway after hallway. I was about to give up when I heard it, a muffled thumping sound coming from behind a door marked storage. My heart pounding, I tried the handle. Locked. "Claire?" I called out softly. The thumping got louder. I was trying to figure out how to break down the door when suddenly it swung open. A tall man with dark hair stood there, Claire behind him. She was tied up, a gag in her mouth, mascara streaking her terrified face. For a split second, we all just stared at each other in shock. Then the man shoved past me, knocking me to the ground as he took off running. "Claire!" I scrambled to my feet and rushed to untie her. "Oh my God, are you okay? What happened?" As soon as the gag was out, Claire started sobbing. I don't know. He grabbed me outside the bathroom. I've been tied up down here for hours. I thought I was going to die." I hugged her tightly, my own tears flowing freely now. "It's okay. You're safe now. Let's get out of here." We made our way back up to the main decks in a daze. The security team was shocked when we stumbled into their office. Soon we were wrapped in blankets, sipping tea as we tried to explain what had happened. But there were so many unanswered questions. Who was that man? How did he get Claire down to that storage room without anyone seeing? And most disturbingly, how did he know we were about to find her? It was like he had been waiting for us. The ship's security launched a full investigation, but they never found the guy. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. They tried to reassure us that he must have been a stowaway who had now left the ship, but something about that explanation just didn't sit right with me. Claire and I spent the rest of the cruise huddled in our cabin, too scared to go anywhere alone. When we finally got home, we both needed therapy to deal with the trauma of it all. But the thing that haunts me most, the detail I can't stop obsessing over, is what the man said right before he ran away. He looked me in the eye and whispered, "You're lucky you found her when you did. 5 more minutes, and she would have been gone for good." How did he know we were about to find Claire? And what did he mean by gone for good? I don't think I'll ever be able to shake the feeling that there was something bigger and more sinister going on, something beyond just a random kidnapping. But I don't know if I'll ever get answers. All I know is that I'm never setting foot on a cruise ship again. From the very first day, I felt uneasy. As I was exploring the ship after boarding, I noticed a man staring at me intensely from across the deck. At first, I brushed it off as nothing, but throughout the day, I kept spotting him everywhere I went, by the pool, in the dining room, even lurking near my cabin hallway, always watching me with those cold, piercing eyes. I tried to ignore it and enjoy myself, but his constant presence was unnerving. On the second day, I decided to mention it to one of the security officers. I described the man and explained how he seemed to be following me, but the officer just brushed me off. He said they couldn't do anything unless the man actually did something threatening. I left feeling frustrated and invalidated. That night, things escalated. I was heading back to my cabin after a late dinner when I spotted him at the end of the hallway. He started walking quickly towards me with this manic look in his eyes. Panicked, I ran and ducked into a nearby maintenance room, praying he hadn't seen where I went. I could hear his footsteps getting closer, then stopping right outside the door. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he'd hear it. After what felt like an eternity, he finally moved on. I was shaking as I snuck back to my cabin and double-checked all the locks. Sleep was impossible that night. Every little noise made me jump. I kept imagining him somehow getting into my room. The next day, I was a nervous wreck. I didn't want to leave my cabin, but I was also terrified of being trapped in there if he found me. I tried to blend in with groups of other passengers when moving around the ship, but no matter where I went, within minutes I'd spot him lurking nearby, always watching. I went back to security and practically begged them to do something. This time they seemed a bit more concerned, but said they still couldn't take action without proof. They suggested I try to get photo or video evidence of him following me. Easy for them to say. The thought of intentionally putting myself in his line of sight made me sick to my stomach. That evening was the cruise's big masquerade ball. I almost didn't go, but I thought the costumes might help me hide from him. I put on an elaborate mask and gown, hoping it would be enough of a disguise. For a while, it seemed to work. I actually started to relax a little as I mingled and danced. But then I felt that familiar chill down my spine. I turned and there he was, staring at me from across the ballroom. Somehow, he'd recognized me despite the costume. Panic set in and I fled the party, running up to the top deck for air. I was gasping for breath, clinging to the railing, when I heard footsteps behind me. Before I could react, he grabbed me. I screamed and struggled as he tried to drag me towards a dark corner of the deck. In that moment, I truly thought I was going to die. Suddenly, there were shouts and running footsteps. Security had finally seen what was happening and came to my rescue. They pulled him off me and restrained him as I collapsed to the deck, sobbing uncontrollably. The rest of the night was a blur of giving statements and being checked over by the ship's doctor. They kept the man in the brig for the remainder of the cruise. When we docked, he was handed over to the local authorities. I later learned he had a history of stalking and assault charges. It's been months since that cruise, but I still have nightmares about those terrifying days at sea. I can't shake the feeling of being watched, even in my own home. I've been seeing a therapist to deal with the trauma, but I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. I keep asking myself why he fixated on me, what I could have done differently, but I know deep down it wasn't my fault. He was a predator, and I was just unlucky enough to catch his attention. I'm sharing my story now in hopes that it might help someone else recognize the signs and get help before things escalate. Trust your instincts and don't let anyone dismiss your concerns. It could save your life. The whole ordeal has left me with a deep-seated fear of traveling alone, especially in confined spaces like cruise ships. The idea of being trapped with nowhere to escape is terrifying. I used to love the ocean, but now the sight of it just brings back those awful memories. I'm still trying to piece together how he managed to follow me so closely without being caught. Did he have access to my itinerary somehow? Was he bribing staff for information? The not knowing makes it even scarier. One of the worst parts was feeling so isolated and helpless, surrounded by hundreds of people having the time of their lives, while I was living in constant fear. I felt like I was in some twisted parallel universe where no one could see the danger I was in. I've become hyper-vigilant since the incident. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, analyzing every stranger's behavior for potential threats. It's exhausting, but I can't seem to turn it off. Part of me knows it's irrational, but another part feels like it's necessary for survival. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever be able to enjoy a carefree vacation again. The idea of relaxing and letting my guard down seems impossible now. I hate that he took that sense of freedom and adventure from me. I've connected with other survivors of stalking, and it's been helpful to know I'm not alone in my struggles. But it's also terrifying to realize how common these experiences are. Why isn't more being done to protect people, especially women traveling alone? I'm still angry at how dismissive the security team was at first. If they had taken me seriously from the beginning, maybe things wouldn't have escalated so far. It feels like they only cared once there was physical evidence they couldn't ignore. The mask from that final night still hangs in my closet. Sometimes I look at it, and it's like I'm right back there on that deck, fighting for my life. Other times it feels like a symbol of survival, a reminder that I made it through. I know logically that he's in custody now and can't hurt me anymore, but emotionally, it's like he's still out there somewhere, waiting. I have to constantly remind myself that I'm safe now. The cruise line offered me a free trip to make up for the experience, but the thought of setting foot on another ship makes me physically ill. No amount of luxury or pampering could erase those memories or make me feel secure. I've started taking self-defense classes, hoping it will help me feel more empowered. But I know deep down that no amount of training could have prepared me for the psychological torment of being stalked like that. Some days are better than others. I'll start to feel like I'm moving past it, like I'm reclaiming my life. Then something small will trigger a flashback, a particular cologne, a glimpse of someone who looks like him, and I'm right back in that state of terror. I keep replaying every interaction, every moment I saw him, wondering if there were signs I missed. Could I have prevented it somehow? The rational part of me knows it wasn't my fault, but the guilt and self-doubt linger. Writing this all out has been both cathartic and anxiety-inducing. Part of me is scared that sharing my story might somehow draw his attention again, even though I know that's not possible. But I hope that by speaking up, I might help someone else avoid a similar nightmare. To anyone reading this who's experienced something similar or who's currently feeling unsafe, you're not alone, and it's not your fault. Don't let anyone minimize your fears. Keep pushing until someone listens. Your safety matters. And to those who haven't experienced this kind of terror, please, if someone confides in you about feeling unsafe, take them seriously. Your support and belief could make all the difference. I don't know if I'll ever fully heal from this experience, but I'm trying to take it one day at a time. Some days are still a struggle, but I'm determined not to let him win by living in fear forever. I survived, and I'm going to keep surviving, no matter what. It was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. My best friends and I had been planning this Caribbean cruise for months. We were so excited as we boarded the massive ship, marveling at the luxurious amenities and picturesque ocean views. The first couple days were absolute bliss, lounging by the pool, indulging in gourmet meals, dancing the night away at the onboard clubs. But on the third day, things took a sinister turn. I was relaxing on the deck, soaking up the sun, when I felt an odd prickling sensation on the back of my neck. You know that feeling when you just know someone is watching you? I sat up and looked around, and that's when I first saw him. He was standing near the railing about 30 feet away, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned suit from the early 1900s. At first I thought it must be some kind of costume for a themed event. But as I studied him more closely, I realized his clothes weren't a costume. They were genuinely antique, threadbare and faded. The man himself appeared to be in his 60s, with thinning gray hair and a neatly trimmed mustache. But it was his eyes that really unnerved me. Even from that distance, I could see how intently he was staring at me. Not in a lecherous way, but with an unsettling intensity, like he was looking right into my soul. A chill ran down my spine. I blinked, and in that split second, he vanished. I jumped up, scanning the deck, but there was no sign of him. I tried to shake it off as my imagination, but I couldn't stop thinking about those piercing eyes. Later that evening, I was heading to dinner with my friends when I saw him again. He was standing at the end of a long corridor, perfectly still, hands clasped behind his back. Again, those eyes were locked onto me. I stopped in my tracks, grabbing my friend Lisa's arm. "Do you see that man?" I whispered urgently. Lisa looked where I was pointing and frowned. "What man? The hallway's empty." But he was right there. I blinked hard, and just like before, he had vanished into thin air. My friends were concerned, asking if I was feeling all right. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but I could tell they thought I was just stressed or dehydrated. I tried to put it out of my mind and enjoy our dinner, but I kept seeing flashes of movement out of the corner of my eye. Every time I'd turn to look, there'd be nothing there. I barely touched my food, too preoccupied with scanning the dining room for any sign of the mysterious man. As we were leaving the restaurant, I saw him again. This time he was seated at the bar, sipping from an old-fashioned glass. But the bartender seemed oblivious to his presence, walking right past him without a glance. I grabbed my friend Mike's shoulder and pointed. "There, at the bar. Do you see him?" Mike squinted, then shook his head. "See who? There's no one sitting at the bar, man." I whirled back around, and sure enough, the bar stool was empty. Not even an empty glass remained. I felt like I was going crazy. How could no one else see this man? That night, I tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling of being watched even in my cabin. Every creak of the ship made me jump. I kept imagining I saw a shadowy figure in the corner of the room, only for it to disappear when I turned on the light. The next morning, I was a wreck. Dark circles under my eyes, jumping at every little noise. My friends were really worried now, suggesting I visit the ship's doctor. But I was convinced there was something sinister going on, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it. I spent the day scouring every inch of the ship, looking for any sign of the mysterious man. I asked crew members if they'd seen anyone matching his description, but they all just gave me odd looks. I even went to the purser's desk to inquire about the passenger manifest, but they insisted there was no one on board fitting that description. As the sun began to set, I found myself wandering the upper decks, feeling utterly lost and confused. That's when I saw him again, standing at the bow of the ship, his back to me. This time, I was determined to confront him. I strode forward purposefully, my heart pounding. "Hey," I called out. "Who are you? Why are you following me?" He slowly turned to face me, those unsettling eyes locking onto mine once more. A chill wind whipped around us as he opened his mouth to speak. But before he could utter a word, a massive wave crashed over the bow. I was knocked off my feet, sputtering and coughing as I was drenched in icy seawater. When I managed to stand up, he was gone. Again. I screamed in frustration, my voice carried away by the wind. I must have looked like a madman, soaking wet and yelling at nothing. That's how my friends found me a few minutes later, a shivering, babbling mess. They practically carried me back to my cabin, deeply concerned about my mental state. They wanted to take me to the infirmary, but I refused. I was terrified of being sedated or locked up, unable to keep watch for the mysterious man. The final day of the cruise passed in a haze. My friends kept a close eye on me, clearly worried I was having some kind of breakdown. I barely left my cabin, too afraid of what or who I might see. Every shadow, every reflection seemed to hold his piercing gaze. As we disembarked, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering dread. I scanned the crowds desperately, half expecting to see him one last time. But there was no sign of the enigmatic figure who had haunted my vacation. In the weeks since, I've tried to make sense of what happened. I've researched the ship's history, looking for any stories of similar sightings or tragic deaths that might explain a ghostly presence. I've even undergone hypnosis, trying to uncover any repressed memories or trauma that could have triggered such vivid hallucinations. But I've found no answers, no explanations that satisfy. My friends still think I had some kind of stress-induced episode. They're probably right. The logical part of my brain knows there must be a rational explanation. And yet, I can't shake the feeling that what I experienced was real, that for whatever reason, I was able to see something or someone that others couldn't. Those eyes still haunt my dreams, filled with an otherworldly knowledge and sadness. I don't know if I'll ever understand what really happened on that cruise, but I do know one thing. I'm never setting foot on another ship again. The ocean holds too many secrets, too many mysteries, and some things perhaps are better left unknown. The drive out there took almost 2 hours, winding through dense forest on increasingly narrow dirt roads. By the time we arrived, I was starting to feel a bit uneasy. The lake was eerily still, surrounded by towering pines that blocked out most of the sunlight. A heavy mist hung over the water, obscuring the far shore. But Alex was excited to get out on the water, so I pushed my apprehension aside and helped him unload the small aluminum boat from his truck. As we paddled out onto the glassy surface, an unnatural silence fell over everything. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing, just the soft splash of our oars. The mist seemed to thicken around us, limiting visibility to maybe 20 feet in any direction. I kept getting the creeping sensation we were being watched. "Hey, Alex, you getting a weird vibe from this place?" I whispered nervously. He just shrugged. "Nah, man, it's just foggy. The fish are probably loving this weather." We fished for about an hour without much luck. I was having trouble focusing, constantly scanning the misty waters around us. That's when I saw it, a dark shape moving through the fog maybe 50 yards away. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I squinted I could make out the silhouette of an old-fashioned wooden rowboat. "Alex," I hissed, pointing. "Look over there. You see that?" He turned to look just as the boat emerged from the mist. My blood ran cold. Sitting motionless in the craft was the figure of a man, but something was very wrong. He was dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothes that looked like they were from a century ago. But it was his face that filled me with terror. It was gaunt and pale as a corpse, with hollow black voids where his eyes should have been. The ghostly fisherman's head slowly turned towards us. Though he had no eyes, I could feel his gaze boring into me. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, but I was frozen in place. Beside me, Alex let out a strangled gasp. "What the f—" His voice snapped me out of my paralysis. "We need to go, now." I grabbed the oars and started frantically paddling towards shore. Alex joined in, his face white with fear. I risked a glance back and nearly screamed. The phantom boat was gliding silently across the water towards us, despite no one visibly rowing. The mist seemed to curl around it like grasping fingers. We redoubled our efforts, muscles burning as we raced for the shore. The quiet splashing of our oars was deafening in the unnatural silence. I could feel icy tendrils of dread creeping up my spine. After what felt like an eternity, our boat scraped against the pebbly shore. We leapt out, stumbling on shaky legs, and sprinted for Alex's truck. I heard a faint wooden thump behind us, the sound of another boat landing. "Don't look back!" I yelled as we crashed through the underbrush. We burst out of the tree line into the small clearing where we'd parked. I fumbled with the door handle, my hands shaking violently. "Come on, come on!" Alex got the driver's side door open and dove in, frantically searching for his keys. I slammed my door shut just as he got the engine started. As we peeled out onto the dirt road, I finally allowed myself to look in the side mirror. A pale figure stood at the edge of the trees, those black empty eyes still fixed on us. Then we rounded a bend, and it vanished from view. We drove in tense silence for several minutes, both breathing heavily. Finally, Alex spoke up. What the hell was that thing?" I shook my head. "I don't know, man, but I never want to see it again." The rest of the drive passed in a blur. It wasn't until we got back to town that I realized we'd left all our fishing gear behind. There was no way in hell either of us were going back for it. I barely slept that night, jolting awake from nightmares of those hollow black eyes. The image of that ghostly fisherman was seared into my brain. In the days that followed, I found myself obsessively researching the history of that lake, looking for any clues. I discovered that about 100 years ago, there were a string of mysterious drownings in that area. The bodies were never recovered. Local legends spoke of an evil presence in the lake that lured in unsuspecting victims. Eventually, the place was abandoned and mostly forgotten. It's been weeks now, but I still can't shake the dread I feel when I think about that day. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I swear I can hear the faint sound of oars on water. I've tried to convince myself it was just some elaborate prank or hallucination. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. I don't know if that thing was a ghost, a demon, or something else entirely. But I do know that I'll never set foot near that godforsaken lake again. Whatever lurks in those mist-shrouded waters, it's better left undisturbed. I just pray it stays there and doesn't come looking for us. If you're ever exploring remote lakes and come across one that feels wrong, that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, my advice is to turn around and leave immediately. Some places in this world are not meant for the living to tread. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I'll carry the scars of that encounter for the rest of my life. I still go fishing sometimes, but only in well-populated areas in broad daylight. The peace and solitude I used to find on the water has been replaced by constant vigilance. Every unusual ripple or shadow makes my heart race. I can't help but scan the shoreline, half expecting to see a pale figure emerging from the trees. Alex and I don't talk about that day much. It's like an unspoken agreement between us to pretend it never happened. But sometimes I'll catch him staring off into the distance with a haunted look in his eyes, and I know he's remembering too. I've thought about reporting our experience to the authorities, but who would believe us? We'd be laughed out of the police station, and part of me is afraid that drawing attention to it might somehow make things worse. like speaking of it could summon that thing from the lake. So I've kept quiet, carrying this burden alone. Until now, I guess. Writing this all out has been cathartic in a way, but it's also brought all those terrifying memories flooding back. My hands are shaking as I type this. To anyone reading this, I know how insane it all sounds. Before that day, I would have dismissed a story like this as the ramblings of a lunatic or a hoax, but I swear on everything I hold dear that every word is true. I don't know why we were allowed to escape when so many others apparently weren't so lucky. Maybe we weren't its type, or maybe we just got lucky. But I feel like I've been living on borrowed time ever since. I know I'll never be able to fully shake the impact of what I saw that day. Those empty black eyes haunt my dreams. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, certain I can hear the creak of oarlocks outside my window. Random mists and fog trigger panic attacks now. I've had to stop taking early morning walks because the sight of mist rising off the grass fills me with paralyzing terror. I find myself compulsively checking and rechecking that my doors and windows are locked at night. Part of me is always listening for the sound of dripping water or the scrape of a boat hull. Rationally, I know that thing is confined to that lake. But late at night, when the shadows grow long and every creak of the house sounds sinister, rational thought goes out the window. In those moments, I'm right back on that misty lake, heart pounding as that ghostly figure glides towards us. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from the trauma of that day, but I hope that by sharing my story, I can at least warn others to be careful. If you ever find yourself in a remote area and get a feeling of inexplicable dread, listen to your instincts and get out of there. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that should not exist, but do. I got a glimpse behind the veil that day, and it nearly broke me. So please, be safe out there, and if you value your sanity, stay far away from misty lakes in the deep woods. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. After a few hours of driving down increasingly narrow and bumpy dirt roads, we finally reached the lakeside. The place was breathtakingly beautiful, with crystal clear water surrounded by dense forest. As we unloaded our gear, I noticed an old, run-down campsite nearby. Tattered tents sagged between the trees, and rusted cookware was strewn about. Something about it gave me an uneasy feeling, but I brushed it off. Probably just some careless campers who left their trash behind, I thought. We set up our own campsite a good distance away and spent the afternoon fishing. The lake was teeming with trout, and we caught enough for a hearty dinner. As night fell, we built up a roaring campfire and cracked open some beers, swapping stories and laughing. It was exactly the relaxing evening we'd hoped for. But as it got later, things started to feel off. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No crickets chirping or owls hooting, just an eerie stillness. I tried to shake the creeping sense of unease, telling myself I was being paranoid. Then we heard it, a twig snapping in the darkness beyond our campfire's glow. Mark and I froze, straining our ears. More sounds followed, the rustle of leaves, soft footsteps. Was it just a deer or raccoon? The noises seemed too deliberate, too human. "Hello?" Mark called out tentatively. "Someone there?" No response, but the footsteps grew closer. My heart was racing now. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it towards the sounds. The beam cut through the shadows between the trees, illuminating nothing. Whatever was out there had ducked out of sight. "Let's just go to bed," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Probably just some animal." We doused the fire and crawled into our tent, but sleep was impossible. Every tiny sound had me on edge. An hour passed, maybe two. Then we heard it again. Footsteps circling our tent. Slow, methodical. And this time, something else. A low, guttural whispering. The words were too quiet to make out, but the sound sent chills down my spine. "Mark," I hissed, "you hearing this?" He nodded, eyes wide with fear. We lay paralyzed, hardly daring to breathe as the whispers and footsteps continued their eerie circuit around us. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the tent. A towering, emaciated silhouette loomed outside. Long, spindly fingers reached for the zipper. "Run!" I yelled, adrenaline surging. We burst out of the tent, nearly colliding with the figure. In the moonlight, I caught a glimpse of wild, sunken eyes and ragged clothes hanging off a skeletal frame. The smell hit me next, like rotting meat and unwashed bodies. The thing let out an inhuman shriek and lunged for us. Mark grabbed a burning log from our smoldering fire pit and swung it desperately. It connected with a sickening thud. The figure staggered back, giving us a precious few seconds. We sprinted for the car, branches whipping our faces as we crashed through the underbrush. The keys. Where were the damn keys? I fumbled in my pockets with shaking hands as Mark screamed at me to hurry. Behind us I could hear it coming. Whispers on the wind, the snap of twigs underfoot. Getting closer, closer. Finally. I yanked the keys out and jammed them into the ignition. The engine roared to life just as a bony hand slammed against the window. That face pressed against the glass, mouth open in a silent howl. I floored it in reverse, tires spitting gravel. We tore out of there like bats out of hell, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't slow down until we hit the main road, hands clenched white-knuckled on the steering wheel. We drove in stunned silence for miles before Mark spoke. What the fuck was that thing?" I shook my head, still struggling to process what had happened. "I don't know, man. I don't know." The rest of the drive home was a blur. We were both too shaken to say much. When I finally crawled into bed as the sun was rising, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Sleep eluded me for days after. It's been months since that night, but I still have nightmares about those glowing eyes in the dark, the whispers that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere, that thing's fingers reaching for me. Mark and I don't talk about it much. I think we both want to forget, but sometimes I catch him staring off into the distance with a haunted look, and I know he's remembering too. I've tried researching that area, looking for any history of strange sightings or missing persons, but I've found nothing concrete, just vague forum posts about eerie sounds in those woods, campers feeling watched. Part of me wants answers, to know what we encountered out there, but a bigger part is scared of what I might find out. So I try to put it out of my mind and go about my days. But late at night, when the house is quiet and still, I swear I can hear those whispers again. I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain what happened to us at that lake. All I know is that I'll never go camping again. Some things are better left alone in the dark. It was supposed to be a fun guys' weekend, just me, Mike, and Chris, heading up to the mountains for some camping and fishing. We'd heard all the local legends about the lake being haunted, but we laughed it off. Stupid kids' stories, we thought. If only we'd known. We arrived at the campsite late Friday afternoon and set up our tents near the shore. The lake was beautiful, crystal clear water surrounded by towering pines. As the sun started to set, we cracked open some beers and got a campfire going. Mike kept trying to spook us with ghost stories about the lake, but Chris and I just rolled our eyes. "Dude, give it a rest," I said. "Let's just enjoy the peace and quiet." As night fell, we decided to take the boat out for some night fishing. In hindsight, that was our first mistake. We should have stayed on land. The lake was eerily still as we paddled out. Our headlamps barely penetrated the inky blackness. A thick mist had settled over the water, limiting visibility to just a few feet around the boat. I remember feeling uneasy, like we were being watched. We'd been out there for maybe an hour when it happened. I had just cast my line when I felt a massive tug. At first I was excited. This had to be a huge fish. But as I started reeling, I realized something was very wrong. Whatever was on the end of my line was way too big to be a normal fish. "Guys, I think I've got something," I called out. Mike and Chris crowded around, shining their lights on the water. That's when we saw it. A pair of glowing yellow eyes, bigger than dinner plates, staring up at us from just beneath the surface. My blood ran cold. Before we could react, something slammed into the bottom of the boat with incredible force. We were nearly thrown overboard. Chris let out a terrified yell. "What the hell was that?" Mike shouted. Another violent impact rocked the boat. Through the darkness, I caught a glimpse of something massive moving in the water. A long serpentine shape easily 20 feet long. Its skin looked scaly and mottled, almost like some kind of reptile. Panic set in. We all started shouting at once, fumbling for the oars. But the creature wasn't done with us yet. A huge clawed appendage shot out of the water and latched onto the side of the boat. I'll never forget the sight of those razor-sharp talons digging into the wood, mere inches from where I sat. The whole boat tilted dangerously as the thing tried to capsize us. Mike grabbed an oar and started bashing at the claw, but it was like hitting solid steel. The creature let out an otherworldly shriek that made my ears ring. I've never heard anything like it before or since, a sound that was part roar, part hiss, entirely inhuman. "Go, go, go!" Chris screamed, frantically paddling. We managed to break free momentarily, but I could see the thing's glowing eyes tracking our movement. It was toying with us. What followed was the most terrifying 10 minutes of my life. We paddled like madmen towards the shore, but the creature kept coming after us. It would disappear under the water, then suddenly surface right next to the boat, slamming into us and trying to knock us over. Each time, we caught glimpses of its horrifying form. That long, sinuous body, the razor-sharp claws, a mouth full of dagger-like teeth. At one point, it managed to punch a hole in the bottom of the boat. Water started pouring in. We were maybe 50 yards from shore at that point, but it felt like miles. "We're not going to make it," Mike yelled. I could hear the panic in his voice, but somehow, miraculously, we did. Just as the boat was about to go under, we hit the shallows. We scrambled out, soaked and shaking, and ran up the beach. I expected the creature to follow us onto land, but when I looked back, there was nothing there. Just the mist-covered lake, as still and silent as if nothing had happened. We didn't even bother grabbing our gear. We just ran to the car and got the hell out of there, breaking every speed limit on the way home. We were all in shock, trying to process what we'd just experienced. Over the next few days, we talked about whether to report what happened. But who would believe us? We had no proof, and the story sounded insane even to our own ears. In the end, we made a pact to never speak of it again. But I can't stop thinking about it. What was that thing? How long has it been in that lake? Are there more of them out there? Sometimes I have nightmares where I'm back in that boat, those glowing eyes rising up from the depths. I wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing. I don't think I'll ever be able to go near a lake again. I know this sounds crazy. If I hadn't lived through it myself, I wouldn't believe it either. But I swear on my life, every word is true. There's something in Crystal Lake, something ancient, something terrifying, and God help anyone who goes out on those waters at night. I don't know why I'm sharing this now. Maybe I just need someone else to know the truth. Or maybe I'm hoping someone out there has had a similar experience and can help make sense of what happened. All I know is that the world is a lot stranger and scarier than I ever realized, and there are some things out there that are better left undisturbed. If you're planning a trip to Crystal Lake, do yourself a favor and stay far, far away. Some legends exist for a reason. I learned that the hard way. I had decided to try out a new fishing spot I'd heard about from some guys at work. It was pretty remote, about an hour's drive from town down some winding back roads, but they said the fishing was incredible, especially at night. I figured it would be the perfect place to unwind after a stressful week. I arrived just before sunset and hiked down to the riverbank with my gear. The area was beautiful, lush forest surrounding a wide, gently flowing river. I found a good spot on a little sandy beach and set up my chair and tackle. As darkness fell, I cast my line out into the calm water and settled in for what I hoped would be a productive night. For the first hour or so, everything was perfect. The air was cool and still, with just the sound of crickets and the occasional splash of fish jumping. I caught a couple of decent-sized trout and was feeling pretty good. But then, gradually, I started to get this weird feeling in the pit of my stomach, like I was being watched. At first, I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark. But the feeling kept getting stronger. I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, scanning the tree line behind me. I couldn't see anything in the shadows, but I just couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on me. I decided to take a break from fishing and eat the sandwich I'd packed. As I unwrapped it, I heard a twig snap somewhere in the forest behind me. I whipped my head around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. Just trees and darkness. I tried to calm myself down, taking deep breaths, but my hands were shaking as I ate. When I turned back to the river, that's when I saw him. On the opposite bank, maybe 50 yards away, there was a figure, a man, tall and thin, standing perfectly still and staring directly at me. Even from that distance, in the dim moonlight, I could tell there was something off about him. His proportions seemed wrong somehow. Too tall, limbs too long. I froze, sandwich forgotten in my hand. We just stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. I kept waiting for him to move, to say something. But he was unnaturally still. I couldn't even tell if he was breathing. Finally, I managed to call out a shaky, "Hello?" My voice sounded pathetically small in the vast darkness. No response, not even a twitch. I was seriously freaked out now. I started gathering up my stuff, never taking my eyes off the figure. I had no idea who this guy was or what he wanted, but every instinct was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. That's when he started moving, but not like a normal person. He took a step forward, right into the river, and then another, and another. He was walking straight across the water towards me, moving with an unnatural smoothness. The strong current didn't seem to affect him at all. Pure terror gripped me. This wasn't possible. People can't walk on water. I scrambled to my feet, dropping half my gear in my panic. I abandoned everything except my car keys and ran. The path back to my car was rough and overgrown. I stumbled through the darkness, branches whipping my face. I could hear splashing behind me. He had reached my side of the river, Heavy footsteps crashed through the underbrush, getting closer. I ran faster than I ever have in my life. My lungs were on fire, legs trembling. But blind terror kept me going. I didn't dare look back. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I burst out of the tree line into the little dirt parking area. My car was the only one there. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking violently. I kept expecting cold fingers to grab me at any second. Finally, I got the door open and threw myself inside, slamming and locking it. I jammed the key in the ignition and peeled out of there, tires spraying gravel. As I fishtailed onto the main road, I glanced in my rearview mirror. There he was, standing at the edge of the trees. Even at that distance, I could see his eyes, black, empty voids that seemed to stare into my soul. I floored it, driving way too fast on the twisting road. I didn't slow down until I hit the highway. I didn't go home that night. I was too scared he had somehow followed me, learned where I lived. I drove to the next town over and got a motel room. I left all the lights on and barely slept. The next day, after the sun was high in the sky, I forced myself to go back and get the gear I'd left behind. Part of me hoped it had all been some crazy hallucination, but when I got there, everything was exactly where I'd dropped it, including clear footprints in the mud, huge, deeper than they should be, leading from the river to where I'd been sitting. I gathered my stuff as quick as I could and got out of there. I've never been back, and I don't think I ever will. I can't explain what I saw that night. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just some crazy guy playing a prank. But deep down, I know it was something else, something not human. I don't go fishing at night anymore. Hell, I barely go into the woods at all these days. I can't shake the feeling that he's out there somewhere, waiting. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, certain I've seen those black eyes staring at me through my window. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. I know this all sounds insane. If someone had told me this story a few months ago, I would have thought they were making it up or on drugs. But I swear on everything I hold dear, this really happened. I don't know what that thing was or why it was after me. All I know is that I'm lucky to have escaped, and I live in constant fear that one day I'll turn around and see that tall, dark figure walking towards me again. It all started with my first job after college. I was desperate for work and jumped at the chance to be a delivery driver for a logistics company in my rural hometown. The pay wasn't great, but beggars can't be choosers, right? Little did I know what I was getting myself into. My first night on the job started off normal enough. I loaded up the van with packages and set off on my route, following the GPS through winding country roads. The fall air was crisp, and a full moon cast eerie shadows across the fields and forests. As the night wore on, I started to get an uneasy feeling. The houses were getting more spread out, and I swear I could hear whispers on the wind. I tried to shake it off, just my nerves getting to me on my first night. Then I pulled up to this old farmhouse way out on the edge of town. It looked abandoned, paint peeling and shutters hanging crooked. But the porch light was on, so I grabbed the package and headed to the door. Before I could even knock, this old woman opened up. She was tiny and frail-looking, but her eyes... Man, her eyes were intense, dark and glittering in the dim light. She snatched the package from me and then grabbed my wrist. Her grip was like iron. "Be careful, boy," she hissed. "They're watching. The shadows have eyes." I tried to laugh it off, but my voice came out all shaky. "Right. Thanks for the warning. Have a good night, ma'am." As I turned to go, she pressed something into my hand. It was a small wooden box, intricately carved with weird symbols. "Take this," she said, "for protection. I mumbled my thanks and practically ran back to the van. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The old woman was still standing on the porch, watching me go. And behind her, I swear I saw something move in the shadows, something that shouldn't have been there. The rest of that night was a blur of paranoia and fear. Every time I got out of the van to make a delivery, I felt like I was being watched. The shadows seemed to move and shift in ways that weren't natural. More than once, I caught glimpses of what looked like humanoid shapes lurking just at the edge of my vision. But when I'd turn to look, there'd be nothing there. By the time I got back to the depot, I was a nervous wreck. My manager, Bill, took one look at me and sighed. "Let me guess," he said. "You had the rural route tonight?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Bill ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Shit, I was hoping—" "Well, never mind. Look, kid, I probably should have warned you. That route, it's got a bit of a reputation." "What do you mean?" I managed to croak out. "We've had a lot of drivers quit after doing that route," Bill said. "They all say the same thing. Shadows that move on their own, whispers in the dark. Some even claimed they saw things, creatures. We thought it was just superstition, you know, but it keeps happening. I wanted to quit right then and there, but I needed this job. So I gritted my teeth and told myself I'd stick it out. It was just my imagination playing tricks on me, right? Wrong. Oh God, how wrong I was. The next night was even worse. The shadows were bolder, more active. I'd see flashes of movement constantly, dark shapes darting just out of sight. And the whispers, they were clearer now. I couldn't make out words, but the voices sounded hungry, eager. I was making my last delivery of the night when it happened. I pulled up to a house, and there she was again, the old woman from the night before. But this time she looked terrified. "You fool!" she shrieked. "I told you to be careful. They're coming for you now. You need to leave, get far away from here. Now!" Before I could respond, she slammed the door in my face. I stood there for a moment, frozen in shock, and then I heard it, a sound like dozens of whispers all at once, growing louder. I turned and saw them, shadows, everywhere. But these weren't normal shadows. They were moving, flowing across the ground like living ink, and they were heading straight for me. I don't remember getting back to the van. One moment I was standing on the porch, the next I was peeling out of the driveway, tires squealing. I drove like a madman, not caring about speed limits or stop signs. All I knew was that I had to get away. The shadows chased me. I could see them in my mirrors, a writhing mass of darkness gaining on me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I don't know how I made it back to town. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was the weird box the old woman had given me. I'd kept it in my pocket, and now I could feel it growing warm against my leg. As soon as I hit the main street, the shadows seemed to retreat. I slammed on the brakes outside the depot and just sat there, gasping for air. Bill came running out, probably wondering why I was back so early. One look at my face and he knew. "Jesus, kid," he said. "What happened out there?" I couldn't even begin to explain. I just handed him the keys with shaking hands and said, "I quit." It's been months since that night, and I still don't know what to make of it all. Was it all in my head? Some kind of mass hallucination that's affected multiple drivers? Or is there really something out there in the darkness, something hungry and patient, waiting for its chance to strike? I don't know, but I do know this. I'll never take another night job again. And whenever I'm out after dark, I keep that little wooden box close, just in case.